So I've been dating my girlfriend for almost a year now, and last month we moved in together. Maybe that's kind of fast, I don't know. My parents sure thought it was, but honestly, everything was great in the beginning. We get along really well, and we've never had more than a brief argument. But then, she started whistling. It's dumb, I know, but she's always whistling this weird song, and it really gets on my nerves. My mum kept telling me that once you move in with someone, you discover all their weird quirks that they've been hiding from you. And it's not like I didn't expect that to be true, but for some reason, this is just an ongoing issue with us, and I don't know what to do. At first I would just hear her whistling it when she was showering. It was kinda cute, like her own little bathroom theme song. I didn't recognise the melody, but it was very distinct. I could mimic it from memory if I wanted to. In fact, sometimes it gets stuck in my head, and it drives me a little bit crazy. You know the type of tune. After a week or so, I asked her what the song was, and she just laughed. I'm wondering if maybe it's something she came up with on her own, something that she does absent-minded, especially once she started doing it more and more. Like, I'd be reading a book, and she'd be on the computer, and she'd just start whistling, and I tried to ignore it, I really did, but I seriously feel like a dick for being so grumpy about it. And I know she wasn't doing it to annoy me, but she'd just go on and on and on, and it would pull all my attention away from whatever I was doing. So I finally said something to her a few nights ago. I was going over some legal documents for work, and she just starts whistling like crazy, on, and I'm trying to just block it out, but it's seriously excessive. I know you guys are probably thinking that I was overreacting, but it felt like she was whistling right into my ear, and it just frayed my last bit of patience. As calmly and nicely as I could, I called out to her and asked her to quiet down. She didn't reply, so I asked again, and she still didn't answer. So I left the bedroom and found her in the living room, watching a movie. She wasn't whistling anymore, and for some reason, that really irked me. It felt like she was messing with me, and then she just looked over at me, like she didn't even know what my deal was. I asked her if she could stop that whistling so much, and she told me she wasn't whistling. Now, I get that maybe she doesn't realise she's doing it, but no one whistles that much and doesn't notice. It's not really like her to mess with me like that, and I don't know what she's trying to get out of this. I thought maybe she was teasing or playing a joke, but she had to see how annoyed I really was. I asked her again to just stop whistling so loudly, and she didn't answer. There was tension in the room, and it felt like our first fight since moving in together. Even though she didn't whistle for the rest of the night, I couldn't focus on my work anyway, because I was upset about the confrontation. Then, of course, the next night she was whistling again. I hear her when she comes home from work, and she just keeps going for at least an hour. I really didn't want to have another fight, so I just hung out in the bedroom and listened to her move around for a while. I felt like I was blowing things out of proportion, but honestly, how hard is it to just not whistle all the fucking time? It was no big deal when it was just now and then, but I feel like she whistles more than she even talks to me now. So, I'm sitting in the room thinking about that, and that's probably why I was so worked up when I finally came downstairs. She was cooking dinner, which is sweet, but she was also still whistling. So I said, softly, "Hey honey, maybe we should just put on some music instead, so you don't have to feel the silence of all that whistling." I tried to play it off like a joke, but I knew she'd probably see through it and get annoyed again. She didn't even turn to face me. She just huffed and kept cooking. After a minute, I told her I was sorry about the other night, but the whistling just sort of strikes my ear wrong, and if she could try not to whistle so much and so loudly, it would make my life a hell of a lot easier. I feel like I was being fair. I know it seems controlling and nitpicky, but it was bothering me a lot. We all have our things, you know. I try not to chew loudly at the table because it bothers her, so why can't she just stop whistling sometimes for me? But she totally freaked out. She turned around and told me she wasn't whistling and she didn't know what my problem was. At this point, I don't get why she was doing this. It obviously wasn't funny for either of us, and she seemed genuinely upset, so I don't know why she just kept provoking me. I asked her what her deal was, why she was so defensive about the stupid whistling, and she told me to shut up. She told me she was sick of talking about it, like I was the one being unreasonable. I never get mad at her, but I just snapped. I told her to stop whistling before I lost my mind. She called me crazy just because I was getting a little upset, and somehow that was all I could take. I grabbed one of the cast iron pans from the stove and swung it at her head as hard as I fucking could. She fell over, and smashed her head on the counter, but I swung the pan again before she hit the ground. I think I maybe hit her 3 or 4 times. I don't remember, but I feel horrible. There was blood everywhere, and her jaw might be broken. No, I think it is for sure. I couldn't believe I'd lost my temper like that, and I have no idea how we can move past this. I feel so ashamed for letting things get physical, regardless of how much she might have been provoking me. But here's the real kicker. She's still fucking whistling. And I asked her nicely to please stop, and now she won't even pause. For 2 days, she's just been lying on the kitchen floor with her eyes rolled back and her mouth hanging open, just marinating in congealed blood, and she's still fucking whistling. I don't know what to do. I don't want to break up, but this is just too much. I need her to shut up. Just shut up. Just fucking shut up. My wife Lynn and I have been together for 6 years and married for 11 months. Our entire history together has been very normal, and not once have I noticed any weird behaviours or red flags. I can't stress enough how out of character this whole thing is for her. Lynn is very kind, intelligent and thoughtful. She's always been the no-nonsense type of person. Being childish or trying to scare me is not something she'd normally do. She doesn't even like watching horror movies. When we first started dating, she agreed to watch The Shining with me because she knew how much I loved horror. She was so scared that she didn't even make it through half of the movie before we had to turn it off. She isn't into anything creepy and has never been into pranks. It's just not her cup of tea. And that's fine. But that's what's so strange about all of this. It's just so unlike her. I should also add that she'd never had any mental health issues, and as far as I'm aware, it doesn't run in her family. I know some people are able to hide their mental health problems, but in the 6 years we've been together, I think I would have seen some sort of sign. 2 months ago, I was in the kitchen making myself some coffee before work. I was running a bit late that morning, and I knew I wouldn't be able to make it to Dunkin' Donuts for my usual morning fix. I took a sip of my coffee as I hurried down the hall towards the front door, when I happened to notice Lynn peeking at me from around the corner ahead of me. I could only see her eyes, and a strand of her long, dark hair hanging up against the wall. The rest of her body was concealed behind the corner. I nearly spilt my coffee when I saw her, but I did also burn the shit out of my lips. "Geez, Lynn," I said, whipping a few drops of coffee from my pants. "You scared the shit out of me." She immediately popped out of view like a little kid that had been caught. I heard her scurry off towards the living room, and by the time I got to the front door, she was out of sight. It was really weird, and just totally out of character for her, like I said, but I also found it kind of funny that she was being more playful and a little less serious. I shouted out that I loved her and called her a weirdo as I shut the door behind me, hearing her laughing. Her behaviour was a little bit odd, yes, but it certainly wasn't something I'd call a priest out for. I forgot about it by lunch, and by the time I got home, she was her normal self. I didn't bring it up, and neither did she, and life went on. The next incident happened 3 days later. It was around 2 AM, and I'd woken up to get a drink. I was standing at the kitchen island, jug of OJ in my hand, when I felt a strong feeling that I was being watched. For whatever reason, I looked down at the floor and saw my wife's smiling face staring back. She was peeking at me from the other side of the island, staring up at me with wide, unblinking eyes and grinning. I screamed, I'll admit it, not out of irritation, but fear. For some reason at that moment, I was scared. At the sound of my scream, Lynn scuttled backwards out of my view, her hands and feet smacking the tile floor as she hurried out of the kitchen on all fours. I didn't run after her, or even yell after her. I just stood, frozen in shock, wondering what the fuck had possessed her to do that. It took me a little longer than I'd like to admit to go back upstairs, but eventually I did. When I got to our bedroom, Lynn was lying on her side, asleep. Or at least pretending to be. I stood there for a while, watching her breathe to be sure she was really asleep. I had a feeling she might jump out at me the moment I got into bed, but she didn't. I climbed into bed and she didn't even move. Her breathing was soft and deep, and I was starting to wonder if I had dreamt the whole thing. The next morning I waited for her to come down for a coffee, and after handing her a mug and kissing her on the cheek, I decided to ask about it. "What was that about last night?" I asked, keeping my tone light so I didn't offend or embarrass her. She frowned over her cup of coffee, shaking her head like she had no clue what I was referring to.
You were peeking at me again, from over there,
I said, pointing to the spot on the floor by the kitchen island. She followed my gaze, and when she looked at me, she burst out laughing. She was laughing so hard that I couldn't help but join her.
You creep me the fuck out sometimes, you know that?
I said. She giggled and set her cup on the counter and wrapped her arms around my neck.
You creep me out all the time, so I guess we're even.
We said our goodbyes and left for work. As I drove, I kept thinking about how creepy it had been seeing her grinning at me from behind the island like that. The sounds her hand made on the floor as she crawled away. I told myself she was just trying to be silly, just trying to join me in my love for all things horror. It's not like I was afraid of her, but it just didn't sit right with me. I started seeing her peeking at me more and more. Sometimes she'd be peeking out from behind the couch or living room curtains. Once, she even managed to get inside of her grandmother's old trunk that sits at the foot of our bed. I might not have known she'd been there at all if it wasn't for the trunk's old hinges giving her away. She'd had the lid propped up just enough so only half of her face peeked through. She'd been grinning like an excited toddler. It was unnerving. I didn't even know what to say to her. All I could do was stare. When I finally found my voice, I asked her why on earth she was doing this. But she didn't answer. She just slowly closed the lid, shutting herself inside the trunk. I walked away, feeling utterly disturbed. I didn't understand why she was doing it, but it clearly made her happy. I just hoped she would tire out of the game quickly. Lynn didn't peek at me for the next 2 weeks, and I started to think she was done with her weird little prank, and I was relieved. We were watching a show on Netflix one night, and I jokingly said I hadn't seen her peeking at me lately, and that she must have given up on her spy game. She looked up at me with a smile and said, "Maybe I've just gotten better at it." I didn't say anything, but I wondered whether or not she was joking. For the next few days I couldn't stop thinking about what she had said. Was she still peeking at me when I wasn't looking and I just hadn't noticed? And if so, what the hell was she getting out of this? I started to feel paranoid, constantly checking whether she was watching me from round the corner or behind the door. I was jumpy whenever I was at home and she wasn't in full view of me. I felt stupid and a little bit crazy, but after a few weeks without another incident, I began to relax. I stopped checking behind furniture and walls and told myself it was just a bad memory. Then, a few days ago, things got so much worse. Lynn left to go to her friends, and I lounged on the couch and played a couple of games on my laptop. Around 9 PM, I hopped in the shower, and as I was washing the soap from my hair, I felt that awful feeling that I was being watched. I slowly opened my eyes and almost had a heart attack. Lynn was peeking at me from behind the shower curtain, her entire head stretched into the shower, leaving just her body outside. Her long dark hair hung up against the curtain, the ends dripping with water. Her mouth hung open with a terrible grin, her eyes wide and red as if she hadn't blinked in a month. I screamed and jumped back against the wall. She didn't move, nor did her smile waver. Her makeup ran down her cheeks in 2 black streaks. She looked giddy and completely deranged. Honestly, I was fucking terrified. She stood like that for a few moments, neither of us saying a word. Finally, after what felt like forever, she slowly pulled her hair back out of the shower, and I watched her blurry figure through the curtain as she moved backwards towards the bathroom door. A second later, the bathroom door slammed shut, hard enough to rattle the mirror. I screamed again and jumped out of the shower to lock the door. I stayed inside the bathroom for over an hour. Maybe I overreacted to some of you, but joke or not, I wasn't going to put up with this crazy shit anymore. That's what I kept telling myself as I paced around in my bathroom, stopping to listen at the door every few minutes. Suddenly, I heard a muffled sound, and I pressed my ear against the bathroom door, straining to listen. I couldn't hear anything, but I envisioned Lynn standing on the other side of the door, giggling at her own joke. I felt a surge of anger. I was beyond pissed at being made to feel scared in my own house, and made to hide in my bathroom for over an hour. All for what? Some joke? If it was a joke, it was a fucking awful one. "What the fuck, Lynn?" I snapped. "This shit is getting really annoying." I waited for her to apologise or to call me a jerk, but instead I heard a faint moan. So quiet I wondered if I heard it at all. And then, complete silence. "Lynn?" I called out, not being able to even hide the shakiness in my voice. I got no response. just my own heavy breathing.
I swear to God, just fucking stop it.
I yelled, pounding my fist on the door. I waited for her to cuss me out, something I'd expect from me talking to her like that. I'd never, ever screamed at her before this. But there was nothing, just the occasional drip from the shower head. I won't deny that I was scared, too afraid to open the damn door and face my own wife. I waited for another half an hour or so, which feels like a fucking lifetime when you're scared. Finally, I decided I wasn't going to spend the night hiding in my bathroom, so I got down on my knees and peered under the door. I almost expected to see her face peeking back at me, but thankfully I didn't. I could see straight down the hallway to the top of the stairs, but no Lynn. I didn't know if I should be happy about that or not. I waited for a few minutes, waiting to see her head pop over the top step, but it never came. I stood up, my hand hovering over the door, mentally preparing myself to open it. I slowly turned the lock with shaky fingers and was about to yank it open when I heard a sound that still makes me feel nauseous when I think about it. A moan. Louder than before, but this time I was able to tell where it was coming from. I turned my head to the closet door as if in slow motion, and locked eyes with my wife who was peeking at me from the slight gap. Her eyes were still wide as ever, and her mouth was hanging open in the most grotesque, gaping smile I had ever seen. I didn't even scream. I was too scared for that. Her hands were clasped to her chest, body trembling with sheer delight, as if she could barely contain her own excitement. A short, raspy moan bubbled up from her throat, deep and raw, sending a shiver through my entire body. Somehow, I found the ability to pull the bathroom door open and ran as fast as I could all the way down the steps, snagging my keys and phone from the table in the living room before running outside to my car. I could hear her shrill laughter behind me, but I didn't hear her getting closer. I didn't even bother shutting the front door. I drove away from the house faster than I legally should have, shivering the entire time, either from fear or the cold, maybe a little bit of both. I hadn't grabbed a coat or even a pair of shoes. I was still in my boxers and my hair was still damp. I drove straight to my brother Chris's house, about 40 minutes away, ignoring any and every call and text I got. I didn't even check my phone until I was safely parked in my brother's driveway. Lynn had called me 4 times and sent a flurry of texts, all wondering where I had gone and why I left like that. I threw my phone at the dash in a rage, furious at her nonchalant attitude. My brother and his wife were surprised to see me, especially dressed in just a pair of boxers, but told me to stay as long as I needed. Chris lent me some clothes and asked me what happened. I told him about Lynn and about the fight, but didn't get into full details. I didn't want him to think I was overreacting, leaving my wife over a prank, even if it was a strange one. I mean, hadn't I encouraged her for years to lighten up instead of being so serious all the time? I'd wanted her to relax and loosen up, but this was definitely not what I had in mind. I tried to sleep on their sofa, but my brain wouldn't let me sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Lynn's face staring at me from inside the closet. Knowing she had been in there with me the entire time made my skin crawl. She had never left the fucking bathroom at all. Instead, she slipped inside the closet and slammed the bathroom door shut to fool me. The mere thought of going back home gave me anxiety. I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Chris ended up giving me a sleeping pill, so I was able to get a little bit of rest. However, my sleep was filled with terrible dreams, all of Lynn's smiling face. I woke up as the sun just started to rise. My sore body ached from the sofa, and I felt drained. I knew I'd have to call Lynn at some point, but I didn't know what to say to her. I wouldn't be going home unless she gave me her word she'd never do any more creepy shit again. I just wanted my wife back. Her normal, serious self never looked so good to me. I was contemplating giving her a call and telling her that, when that familiar feeling came over me again, I was being watched. I was staring at the ceiling, my heart in my throat. I didn't want to look away, but the longer I ignored the feeling, the worse it got. My eyes drifted away from the ceiling almost on their own. Her face was pressed up against the window beside the couch, staring down at me with the same gaping smile. Drool dribbled down her lips, leaving 2 long streaks down the glass. I didn't know how long she had been there, but something told me she had been there quite a while, possibly all night. I didn't bother screaming, though I was afraid anger triumphed any fear I felt at that moment. I jumped up from the couch and pounded my palm against the glass.
Lynn, are you crazy? What the hell is wrong with you? Just go home.
I shouted. She didn't move, and her ghastly expression never changed. If anything, her smile only grew, as if she had never been more elated. I could hear Chris and his wife moving around upstairs, as if Lynn could hear them from her place outside. Her head twitched slightly in their direction, and she began to close her mouth slowly. Chris called my name from upstairs, obviously concerned. I turned to see him and his wife Rebecca hurrying down the steps. When I turned back to the window, Lynn was gone. The only sign she'd been there at all was the 2 streaks of drool still dripping down the glass. I tried explaining to Chris and Rebecca about waking up to see Lynn watching me through their window, but they were sceptical. Who wouldn't be? Chris and I went outside to the spot in front of the window where she had been, but there were no footprints in the dirt, just a slight indent. I called out of work that day and turned my cell phone off. I didn't want to face Lynn. Just talking to her was too much for me at that point. I really started to believe something was irreversibly wrong with her, that no matter what promises she made, she'd never be the same again. The thought saddened me to my core. I cried most of the morning. By noon, I figured I was ready to confront her, give her one last chance to explain herself. I could at least give her that after 6 years, I told myself. I turned my phone on and saw dozens of texts she had sent, all from a seemingly concerned wife. Can we talk? I love you. Please call me. I'm really worried. Can you answer? Just come home. And more of the same, all texts telling me she loved me and she wanted me home, how worried she was. Not a damn one addressing the crazy shit she pulled, like she hadn't been acting like a character from a Stephen King book. Even her texts were different. She normally texted novels just to tell me to pick up a loaf of bread. You'd think she'd have more to say to me after the bizarre shenanigans she's been pulling. I know it probably seems childish to some of you who are miles away from the situation, but if you saw the way Lynn had looked at me, how she scampered away on all fours like some wild animal, grinning at me from inside the closet like a lunatic, then I think you'd find my reaction was warranted. I ended up staying at Chris's and Rebecca's for another night. I didn't wake up yesterday until afternoon, and thankfully I didn't see Lynn's face watching me through the window. I don't want to pry because it isn't my place, but is this fight something that can be mended? Rebecca asked. She made us both a sandwich for lunch, and I knew she wanted to breach the subject without seeming to be nosy. I don't know, she seems like a different person, I said, choosing my words carefully. I still wasn't ready for her or Chris to know the full extent of the batshit craziness I'd been dealing with. People change, Ben, but she's still the same woman you married. Maybe you both just need to talk through your issues. Whatever's going on, I'm sure it can be fixed, she said, ever the peacemaker. I think it's beyond that now. I don't think talking would help. I just don't trust her, I said. The words stung in my heart. I missed her and I loved my wife. But how could I live with someone like that? Living in constant fear doesn't sound too appealing. Lynn loves you. She has to be absolutely crushed, she said. I don't know about all of that, I said. Well, she certainly seems like it to me. I've never seen her so upset. Very much unlike the Lynn I know, Rebecca said, shaking her head sadly. It took a full minute for her words to really sink in, and when they did, I felt a dread worming its way through my skin. Wait, what do you mean? You saw her? You saw Lynn? I asked, my mouth suddenly dry. Rebecca nodded casually, as if that fact wasn't nightmare fuel. She stopped by this morning just after Chris left for work, she said, cleaning the plates from the table. I didn't see her car though. Maybe she took an Uber or something. Beck, what did she say? Did she come inside? I asked, sweat starting to break out from my forehead. I began looking around, examining corners as though a predator lurked behind them. No, she just asked if you were awake yet, and I said you weren't. I asked if she wanted me to wake you up, but she said no. She just said to let you sleep, she said as she was washing the dishes. That's it, that's all? She didn't say anything else? I asked. No, she looked awful though, like she hadn't slept in days. I think you should call her. I got up from the table and thanked Rebecca for lunch. I felt a little bit better at the knowledge that at least she hadn't come inside. Still, I needed to double check that the doors were locked. I sat for a while trying to figure out what to do next. I didn't want to go home, but I felt like I owed it to Lynn to help her if I could. Hadn't I sworn an oath to love and honour her through sickness and in health? She clearly was very sick. If she was sick, which I truly believe she was, I had to try and get her the help she needed, but I didn't even know where to start. I didn't want to call the police, and besides, what the hell were they going to do? And what would I tell them? That my wife was peeking at me? That she was being creepy? As bizarre as she had been, she still hadn't committed any crime. Not yet, anyway. The police would probably have said that I was overreacting, but this wasn't some prank. It felt wrong, dangerous even, like something sinister lurked beneath her smile. I knew as her husband I was well within my rights to have her committed, but what if she simply acted normally in their presence? She had obviously been able to fool Rebecca into thinking she was just a concerned wife. As long as the doctors didn't find her a danger to herself or others, they'd have no choice but to release her after 72 hours. I felt lost and overwhelmed, so I did what any husband in my position would do. I called her mother. I didn't want to, believe me. Her mother and I weren't on the best of terms. We never fought or anything like that, but we just didn't get along. She wasn't a very warm person and wasn't really easy to get along with at all. She hardly ever smiled, and when she did, only her lips would move into a thin smile, leaving her eyes as blank as before. She gave off this aura that felt like she was permanently on the offensive. I'd only met her twice, and both times were for such short visits. I got the impression she didn't approve of me for her daughter. Lynn always ushered us out quickly, as she didn't want me to feel uncomfortable, which I was grateful for. Being in her mother's company felt almost unbearable, like walking on glass. I was so glad when we moved 3 states away, as we didn't have to see her as often. I was happy to avoid the woman, but now I needed her help. I really didn't want to have to talk to her at all, but I had to talk to someone, and someone who knew Lynn better than I did. So I grit my teeth and did what I had to.
Yes.
She answered, already sounding irritated.
Marie, it's me, Ben. Do you have a minute to talk?
I asked. I could hear her cluck her tongue in irritation.
I'm in the middle of writing some checks, but if you insist, I suppose I could spare a moment. What is it that you want to discuss, Benjamin?
She said, coldly.
It's about Lynn. She's been acting strangely, and I was wondering if you had any idea whether there was something...
I was quickly interrupted.
It's a bit difficult to follow your ramblings, Benjamin. What is it you want from me?
She asked. I could almost see her standing there in her thin sweater and slacks, tapping her fingernails impatiently on the table.
I just wanted to know if you'd ever noticed any odd behaviour, or possibly any mental health issues.
I asked. There was a long, uncomfortable pause. I couldn't tell if she was just thinking or something else. Finally, after a few seconds, she spoke.
I'm not sure if this is one of your jokes, Benjamin, but if so, I don't find the humour in it. Now, I do have business to attend to, as I've said, so if you don't mind...
She said, but I cut her off before she could get rid of me.
Marie, it's not a joke. I'm sincerely concerned about Lynn's mental health. Her behaviour has been very erratic lately. I'm very worried about her, and I figured as you're her mother, you would know her best.
I said, my frustration evident in my voice.
If you're truly concerned, then I suggest you get health professionals involved. I don't know what you expect of me.
She snapped. I could tell she was seconds away from hanging up, and for some reason I was desperate not to let her. I had the feeling that she knew a lot more than she was letting on.
Please, if not for me, do it for Lynn.
I tried. I heard a faint, shaky intake of breath, as if she was trying to hold her steely persona together, but failing.
Marie, what?
I started.
Benjamin, I don't know what to tell you. My only advice would be to seek professional help. Do not call here again. Goodbye.
I tried to call out to her, but she'd hung up. I tried to wrap my head around the call and her refusal to help me. Even if she didn't like me, why wouldn't she try to help her own daughter? I couldn't understand that. I tried to replay the conversation, desperate to find something I missed. After a while, I almost gave up, until I remembered her last words to me. Seek professional help. She had said those words with a bit of urgency. I could have just been grasping at straws, but no. I was sure her voice had changed ever so slightly when she had said that, as if they were very important. What had she meant? I assumed she was referring to medical professionals, but maybe she was just referring to someone else. Someone that she didn't, for some reason, feel comfortable saying directly. Or maybe I was just desperate. I waited for Chris to get home, and after a very long and exhausting conversation with him and Rebecca, I convinced them that Lynn truly needed psychiatric help. I didn't tell them everything. I wasn't prepared to get into that yet, but I told them about our last encounter, how she'd hidden in the bathroom, peeking at me from the closet. They were obviously shocked, but thankfully they believed me. They too just wanted to help her. Still, they didn't think it was all that serious. Weird, maybe, but not dangerous. They just kept saying that Lynn had to be playing some kind of weird joke. Chris didn't think we should involve the police just yet. He offered instead to go with me, and I readily accepted. He reasoned that calmly talking to her, trying to coax her into going willingly, was the best recourse, and I agreed to do it his way. At least I wouldn't be going into this house alone. We drove over this morning, just after breakfast. There was no way I was going at night. When we pulled into the drive-thru, my stomach began doing somersaults. Her car wasn't there, but I still didn't let my guard down. The front door was ajar, and for a split second I thought we'd see her eyes staring through the gap. I was shaking and starting to sweat. Chris, however, was completely fine. He waited for me to open the door, his hand in his pockets like he was going on a fucking stroll through the park. I envied his ignorance. I pushed the door open and was immediately hit with the stench of rot. Chris smelled it too, and he walked in the house behind me with his nose scrunched up.
What you guys use to clean the floors around here? Shit?
Chris mumbled. Shut up, I said, my eyes darting around for any signs of Lynn. The house was deadly quiet and dark despite being 10 in the morning. All of the curtains were closed up tight, refusing to allow in any sunlight. If I hadn't left in just 2 days prior, I'd have thought the house to be abandoned. We moved through each room, carefully, checking any place that she might hide, occasionally calling her name.
Why the fuck are you looking under the couch?
Chris asked eventually.
Aren't we looking for your wife?
He was looking at me like I was a moron.
Let's just go upstairs,
I whispered. He shook his head but followed me up to the stairs to check the bathroom and the spare bedroom. On the way up, my shoes crunched over pieces of glass that looked to be littered over a few steps. I noticed that one of Lynn and my wedding portraits that hung on the wall alongside the staircase had been smashed. The frame hung crookedly, all the glass removed. I stared at the picture, a lump forming in my throat. We had taken the photo just after leaving the church, after saying our vows. She looked so beautiful in her white gown. I looked at Lynn's beautiful face. I never dreamed her face would ever be the source of terror for me. We climbed the rest of the steps and checked the spare bedroom, but it looked completely untouched. I was hesitant to go into the bathroom, my fear of that night coming back to me all at once. Chris noticed and offered to go in by himself, but I couldn't let him do that, so we just walked in together, checking the closet and the shower. The bathroom looked as if it hadn't been touched since the night I left.
I don't think she's in here, Ben. Why don't you just pack up some clothes and we'll try coming back tomorrow or something?
I nodded and went into our bedroom and shoved some clothes into a duffel bag. When I checked inside our closet, I came across the source of the smell and gagged. Chris took one look and lost all of the colour in his face. He had to go stand by the stairs to get away from the sight and smell. I gazed down in shock at what lay inside my bedroom closet. Soaking into the rug were at least a dozen eyeballs, all carefully laid out in pairs. Some were as large as a quarter, while others were as tiny as a marble. I stared down at the eyes she had collected from small animals and wondered how she had gotten them, and shuddered at the thought.
Man, I thought I had it bad with Becca's shoe addiction, but fuck me, your wife's in here collecting eyeballs,
Chris said, gagging.
Ben, I really think we should go,
he called from the hall. I grabbed my duffel bag and shut the closet door on my new nightmare. I stepped out onto the hall and took a deep breath of air. I could taste the rot on my tongue. I couldn't help but gag.
Who the fuck lines up eyeballs in their closet like that?
Chris mumbled.
I tried to tell you she needed help,
I said.
She doesn't need help, Ben. She needs a fucking exorcist. You coming or what? I can't stand this smell any longer.
His words died in his throat and his eyes grew wide with fear. I asked him why, but I could feel it. Someone was watching me, and I didn't think it was the eyes in the closet. I turned around, my eyes slowly scanning the bedroom. Christ, I whispered as I finally saw what we'd missed. Under the bed, curled on her side, watching us with the excitement of a kid on Christmas morning, was my wife. She held her hands together just under her chin, and they were shaking eagerly. Now that she knew she had been found, I could hear the quiet noises she was making, a sort of hiccuping sound in her throat, as if the excitement was just too much for her. It was unnerving to say the least. Wide eyes and that same huge smile. Everything in me told me to run, but I forced it away. This was my wife. No matter how twisted, she was still the woman I married, still the woman I loved, and I had to help her. "Lynn," I said softly. She didn't respond, but her head bobbled back and forth in two quick little movements as if she was nodding.
Baby, I just want to help, okay? Can you let me do that?
I asked. I had taken a single step forward, approaching her like some kind of dangerous animal.
I love you, Lynn. I really love you,
I said softly, taking another step closer. She let a tiny moan escape her wide open mouth, and I had to resist the urge to run. Her shoulders were starting to quiver, and her eyes grew large as saucers. I crouched down so I could see her better, and immediately saw the blood. Her hands were covered in it. They trembled the closer I got, as if she was barely able to contain herself. "Lynn, are you hurt? You're bleeding," I said. She bobbled her head again, her bloody fingers moving up and down as if she was playing an invisible piano. They occasionally grazed her chin, leaving smears of blood on her skin. I wanted to recoil in disgust. The smell that was coming off her was revolting. I could feel the vomit from the bottom of my throat trying to climb up and escape. Her lips were dry and stretched thin, blood seeping between the cracks. I knew she wouldn't come out of there on her own, but I didn't want to leave her in the state she was in. I scooted closer and reached out to her. The excited hiccuping sounds got louder and her hands shook, fingers flexing. It was then that I could see the blood oozing from in between her fingers. "Oh God, Lynn, you're bleeding," I said. Instinctively I reached out to take her hand, but before I could even touch her, her hand sprang out towards me. A sharp pain shot through my arm and I fell back onto my arse. My arm burned and I could see the blood dripping down onto the carpet. I looked back at her in shock and saw her grinning madly, her fingers clutched around a shard of glass.
You okay in there?
I turned my head slightly and nodded to him, cradling my arm to my chest. When I turned back to face Lynn, I saw her focus had shifted. She wasn't looking at me anymore, and she wasn't smiling anymore either. She was staring past me, her eyes glaring at Chris the way a hungry lion might stare at a gazelle. Her mouth was still hanging open, but it was twisted into a snarl. I got up onto my feet and began walking backwards down the hall, afraid to take my eyes off her. Are you bleeding?" Chris asked. The moment the words left his mouth, Lynn started fast scooting out from under the bed and the glass shard still in her hand. "Chris, run, go!" I yelled. He must have been too afraid to move because a second later I felt my back bump into him. He was still standing at the top of the stairs, staring at the horror that was my wife. Lynn had crawled completely out from under the bed and stood in the bathroom doorway, her face twisted in rage. Her whole body was visibly tense. Blood ran down her fingers and onto the floor.
"Jesus, Lynn, you playing hide and seek?"
Chris said. I reached back and pushed him towards the steps.
"Move your arse, Chris,"
I said as quietly but firmly as I could. Lynn bobbed her head in fast, sharp movements and began to grin, stretching her mouth open wider and wider so her chin seemed to touch her chest. I heard Chris mutter a prayer and then he began running down the stairs. I stood at the top of the steps, stuck between the love of a woman who clearly needed serious help and self-preservation.
"I only wanted to help,"
I said, choking, holding back tears. Her eyes focused on me once again as she slowly lifted the glass, holding it out in front of her. And then she started sprinting towards me, grinning with utter excitement. Thankfully my body took over and I flew down the stairs, skipping 2 or 3 at a time. I made it to the front door before I felt her leap onto my back, wrapping her arms around my neck, her open mouth next to my ear so I could hear those terrible hiccuping sounds up close. I shook her off me, knocking her back to the floor. I felt a searing pain in my back as she went, but I tore open the front door and bolted to my car. Chris was standing in the front yard, talking on the phone with the police. I didn't say a word, I just ran to my car and jumped in. Chris took the hint and followed me, still on the line with 911. I watched the rearview mirror, sure I'd see her there, running after us, but I never did. I went straight to the ER and got 11 stitches in my arm and 3 on my back. The police asked a lot of questions and went back to the house to do a search, but, of course, Lynn wasn't there. They advised me to stay with a friend or a relative for a while and file a restraining order as soon as I could, but none of those things would matter. Somehow, I just knew. I dropped Chris off at home and went to a motel an hour away. I wanted to put as much distance between me and Lynn as I possibly could. This is where I've been for the last 4 hours. I thought maybe the police would find her. Maybe they'd get her the help that she so desperately needs. But now, I don't think so. Because 40 minutes ago, I got a text from an unknown number. Just 3 words.
I found you.
And a picture attached. The picture was dark and grainy, but I instantly knew what it was. There was no mistaking my wife's eyes. I started typing this out immediately after. I don't know what to do. I'm alone and scared, and I can't help but feel that I'm being watched. I met my girlfriend, Victoria, 7 months ago in a bar. We felt an instant connection and started dating 3 days later. She brought nothing but happiness, the perfect definition of a soulmate. So when I graduated from university, we both agreed to move in together. She's 2 years older than me and was already working, so I moved into her house. However, after moving in, everything went downhill. The first incident happened on the first night of moving in. Victoria works night shift, so she was getting ready to head out. "Babe, I'm heading off now. Just to tell you again, the neighbours next door get a little cranky at night, so just ignore them," she said sweetly. Yeah, I get it," I responded. I gave her a kiss goodbye and she left, leaving me alone in her house. I sat down on the kitchen table and got to work. For context, I work remotely as a character designer for a video game company. It was peaceful for a few hours, until the clock hit 2 AM. The cranky neighbours began screaming profusely. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but it sounded like an intense argument. I tried ignoring it for a while, but eventually the sound became unbearable. Banging was heard on the walls, glass shattering on the floor, followed by more screaming and arguing. So much so that it sounded like multiple voices overlapping with each other. I tried blasting music in my headphones, but that didn't help. Eventually I couldn't take it anymore, so I called it a night and stopped working. The next day passed by in a flash. I chose not to tell Victoria about the neighbours, since apparently it was normal, and I didn't want her to think that it bothered me so much. It was her house, after all. Nighttime came and I was watching TV on the sofa when the arguments from the neighbours came again. Thumping, glass shattering, furniture being thrown around. You'd think their house is a WWE ring. Suddenly, I started hearing banging on the door, followed by blood-curdling screaming. "What the fuck?" I said while pausing the movie I was watching. The neighbour was trying to break into the house. That's it. That was the last straw. I got up and went to the back door where the banging and screaming was being heard. I grabbed the knife from the kitchen table in case the man would break the door. Thank God it was locked. Just in case, I leaned against it, each punch crushing my back. My heart was racing, my hands were shaking. I didn't even know what to do. For all I knew, this man could seriously hurt me. It felt like an eternity before what I'm assuming is a man stopped banging the door. Concurrently, the screaming stopped, and it was silent. There was no way I was going to live in these conditions. I decided I was going to confront Victoria about it when she got home. With that in mind, I made sure all the doors were locked, windows shut, and went to bed. A few hours later at 6 AM, my girlfriend got home and laid down in the bed next to me. She hugged me from behind and gave me a kiss on the nape, waking me up. "How's everything?" she asked softly. "Were the neighbours loud?" I grunted and turned my head to face her, rubbing my eyes. "What?" Victoria giggled. "How did it go with the neighbours?" I found it strange that she'd asked me that today but not yesterday. Maybe it was me being tired. "The husband tried breaking in," I said. "He banged on the door for at least 2 minutes, screaming. I thought that was the end for me. Seriously, Victoria, I don't think this house is safe for us to live in." She smiled sweetly and said, "As long as the door is locked, you should be fine." I gave Victoria a serious look. "Listen, I can't live with these conditions." I tried to say it as nicely as possible. "I didn't even feel safe in the house last night. You're telling me this is going to happen every single night?" Victoria looked down, her eyelids drooping in discomfort. I felt sorry blaming her for something that wasn't her fault, but obviously we needed to do something about it. I can't fear for my life every night.
I'll call the wife tonight and see if anything can be done.
She hugged me tightly. I smiled and kissed her on the forehead. Thank you, baby. I know it's not your fault, but it's impossible to live in fear in my own house every night. On the following evening, Victoria left for her night shift. Once again, I was left alone in her house. She texted me around 15 minutes later, telling me that the problem was solved and it should be better tonight. I thanked her and laid down on the sofa to wind down. I ended up falling asleep while watching a movie. I woke up a few hours later at 4 AM to screaming from the psychotic neighbours once again. Furious, I got out of bed and prepared myself for confrontation. I was ready to finally get to the bottom of this. However, as I walked closer to the front door, something felt off. I noticed the voices and banging was a little closer than usual, as if they were in the same house. It was the first time I ever paid attention to where the sound was truly coming from, but it was still unexpected. Subtle, but unexpected. Following the traces of the sound, the screams didn't make it to the front entrance, or to the house next door. They took me to the basement door, the only part of the house I haven't gone into yet. My heart began racing. This has to be my hallucinations. The sounds can't be coming from my girlfriend's basement, right? With my legs trembling, I tried to push the basement door open, but it was locked. It only resulted in an even louder screams coming from downstairs. They sounded like a cry for help. What the fuck is down there? I muttered. The thought alone sent shivers down my spine. Thankfully, or unthankfully, my uncle taught me lockpicking when I was younger in case I was ever in a dangerous situation where I needed it. So if there's ever been an opportunity to use that skill, it would be now. I took 2 paper clips and started fidgeting with them inside the lock. In just a few minutes, the door unlocked, but it still wouldn't open. I looked around the house for anything I could use, until I found a crowbar. Using all my might, I pushed the door open. Looking back, I wish I hadn't. Instantly, I heard loud, blood-curdling screams piercing my ears. Screams that you would only hear in horror movies. Covering my ears, I forced my way downstairs. What I saw was horrific. Dead bodies of dozens of guys were organised in a line on the floor across the basement. Worst of all, every guy there looked to be around my age, mainly looking like the exes Victoria talked about in passing. Above them was a jar. Inside it looked to be their faces, with a large glow surrounding them. They were screaming in absolute agonising pain. From what I saw, it looked to be their souls. The sealed, trapped souls of innocent men facing endless pain in the afterlife. The stench was unbearable. Their bodies were bled out, as if everything inside of these men was sucked out, only to leave their pure skin. Despite that, their faces were somewhat recognisable. Every body neatly placed to keep its original shape. Their names written in blood in front of each body. Jack, Noah, Michael, etc, etc. Their screams sounded more like loud gasps from up close. The room was so loud I was getting dizzy. The screams only got louder. It sounded loud enough to screech into my brain. My mind went blank. My body shaking at the thought that this was my girlfriend's creation. It got even worse when I got to the end. Another name was written in blood, with no body behind it, as if it was still being prepared. Dylan. That was my name. And then I got a notification on my phone, a message from Victoria. My heart stopped just by reading it. Hey babe, on my way home. Sorry about yesterday. Let's have some fun tonight.
May I please have your attention? The store will be closing in 5 minutes. Please bring your items to the checkout now. We thank you for shopping with us today.
I'm a police officer in the southern United States, in a suburban department of about 100 sworn officers. I work in a college town. I've been on about 10 years now, made sergeant 4 years ago, but at the time of this story, I was just 2 years on, working night shift patrol. I've been lucky that not a lot has affected me, mentally anyway, during my career. I don't have kids, and that's how it gets to you usually. You could build all the mental walls you want, but when you have an emotional connection with your kids and see something happening to kids, the walls mean nothing. Anyway, this one stuck with me. Still makes my hair stand on end, especially when it rains. It was September, just after midnight. I get put on a call with shots fired. Now, normally, these calls turn out to either be fireworks or perhaps a car backfiring, but mostly fireworks. So unless we get multiple calls on it, or a confirmed gunman, or someone confirmed wounded, we just send out one unit. That night, it was me. The shots fired was reported around a college football stadium. This was during football season, so there was a lot of really big white tents set up all around the parking lots for tailgaters. I notified dispatch that I was on scene and started rolling through the parking lots, casting my spotlight here and there. It was raining, pretty heavily, and it was hard to see. About halfway through the lots, my spotlight illuminated the silhouette of a man sitting in a folding chair under one of those really big tents. I pulled closer and lit him up, notifying dispatch that I was out with one in the parking lot. His back was to me. He appeared to be hunched forward, as if his elbows were on his knees and his head leaning forward. I walked closer towards him and started calling out to him. Can't remember exactly what I said, but it was something like, "Hey man, you okay? You heard anything strange? Can you talk to me?" He didn't move or answer. As I drew closer, I lit him up with my flashlight again. I then noticed the outline of a shotgun on the pavement next to him. Combined with him not answering and the nature of the call, it was enough for me to break leather and have dispatch hold the channel. I kept calling to him as I approached, asking him to show me his hands. 30 feet, 20 feet, 10 feet. My handgun, a Glock Model 22, had a Streamlight TLR-1 light on it, so I had him lit up. 6 feet, under the tent with him, 5 feet, 4 feet. I close on him, come around him to the front. Shotgun suicides are difficult. Often, if they put the barrel under their chin, the blast from the barrel will blow the gun out from under the chin before the shot ever hits them. There was a guy in my hometown that succeeded in a shotgun suicide, only because he did it in front of a pond. Put the barrel under his chin, pulled the trigger, only managed to blow his face off. Coroner said he probably ran around screaming through the hole that used to be his mouth before he drowned in the pond. This guy, however, succeeded, blew his head right clean off. When you do this job long enough, you notice funny little details. His elbows were indeed resting on his knees. It was as though he blew his head right off, set the shotgun on the ground next to him, and then leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees to think about what he had done. About that time, I noticed that even though I was under the tent with him, it felt like it was still raining. And then I looked up. This is probably the creepiest, most unexplainable thing that has ever happened to me. I used to work overnight as a security guard at the local port. Usually none of the port workers would stay overnight except for the safety official. I wouldn't be on shift alone since the site had a radius of nearly 2 miles. Overnight, usually there would be 3 guards, including me. Since the area was fairly big, there were different posts, but front gate was the main entrance area where all the guards would be stationed overnight, since there was no need to put them in the other posts due to the fact there was no activity in the site at this time. The veteran guards had been there for years and would often talk about the fact they thought this site was haunted, given the fact that there were accidents and deaths that occurred in the area a long time ago. I was aware that people died there due to freak accidents, and I do believe in angels and demons since I'm actually a religious person. But I always thought that the superiors were just messing with the new guys. A little bit of hazing wasn't uncommon in this line of work. I would work 5 to 6 nights out of the week, and for the first few weeks I never really saw or heard anything out of the ordinary, except for maybe a few questionable creaks, and would see a few misplaced objects while doing my patrol rounds, but nothing too crazy. Just to describe the setting to you, this is a fairly big site, and on occasions where there were big projects being constructed at the port, the workers would sometimes stay overnight. Due to the fact port workers would often have to stay for a few days, there were gyms in the site for their convenience. This gym in particular is fairly old. In the gym there's a sauna, weights, and even a racquetball court. If you don't know what a racquetball court is, it's similar to an indoor tennis court with thin plastered walls and thick glass doors. Usually, on our patrol rounds, me and one of the other guards, Mike, would stop by the gym and play a few rounds before returning back to the front gate. On one of those nights, me and Mike decided to hit a full workout instead of just playing racquetball in the cage. This is around 2:30 AM, and the entire building is so quiet that you can hear the electricity running through the lights. The air conditioner is off, and so is everything else. In fact, the only thing running at all are the lights. 15 to 20 minutes into the workout, we hear a loud thump. We crossed it off as nothing and continued working out. Then a few more minutes, and we heard the loud thump once more. At first we thought it was our lieutenant, which it could have been, since he often walked around checking in on us at this time of night. But then we radioed him, and he gave us his location, which was front gate. We tried to think logically on what it could be, making those loud thumping noises that were coming from the court on the other side. We thought it was the air conditioner, but then we remembered that it was off. And even when it is on, during the day there are no reports of thumps coming from the air conditioner. After a few more minutes, the thumps started occurring one right after another. Saying we were creeped out at this point was an understatement, but what we were about to witness still scares the absolute shit out of me to this day. We started to approach the other side of the gym to where the glass door was. We turned on the flashlight and aimed it towards the clear glass door, and I got chills all over my body and started tearing so much out of fear I was about to cry. We saw one of the balls rolling slowly by itself inside of the court, but there was no one in there, so that must mean that the loud thumps were the balls mysteriously being tossed around against the walls as if someone or something was playing inside the cage. We were both so confused and frightened to how this was really happening. We couldn't make sense of any of it. We were both scared shitless, and we started yelling and running away because we knew there was probably something evil toying with us right there. As we sprinted full speed back to the front gate, the lieutenant saw us and asked us why we were tearing and running in a ridiculous manner. We told him what we witnessed, and his facial expression scared us even more. And then he said,
"That's why there's always guards that quit often. There's something evil in that area, and that's not the first time that something bad has happened in there."
He then showed us security footage of dark figures and shadows literally passing through the office areas and lights mysteriously switching on and off. Till this day, I still get chills recounting my experience with my friends and family, and I'm even getting chills right now as I write this on the paper. I had never, ever had a real encounter with something supernatural until that night. Many say that it was a demonic presence just messing around. Others say it was a ghost of a dead person who died in that area. Honestly, I don't know what it was, but I didn't last much longer in that job after that. I mean, who would? I'm a retired paramedic, and this is probably the most terrifying story I have to share during my experience on the job. I had a call on a very desolate stretch of area of a car sitting in the middle of the road, covered in blood. Of course, like most stories, it had to happen at 2 AM. We arrive on scene and find a new Camaro sitting in the middle of the road that had obviously been in an accident. Problem is, there is absolutely nothing else around the car. No person, no other vehicles, nothing. Part of my job then was being a tactical paramedic for our sheriff's department. I know, it sounds all exciting and high speed, low drag, but nope. As a paramedic, I got to sit around and wait for the police to do the real work. This being said, my paramedic partner and I both had pistols in the ambulance, so at least that gave me some sort of thrill. Anyway, as we start approaching the Camaro, my partner is shining a light around when he says really low, hushed and rushed, "Back, back, 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 now, now, now." I shined my light in the car, and there's intestines wrapped around the gear shifter and a lung in the back seat. So, we kind of freaked out, called dispatch, let them know what's happening, and we were in the process of getting out of there until the cops show up, when we see a figure appear walking down the road towards us. As he gets closer, we see he's covered in blood and gore. We both throw on our tactical vests and helmets, snatch our pistols as I sound like a frightened Home Alone 9-year-old on the radio to dispatch. We approach and start screaming at him to get on the ground, which he does. After everyone's heart rate is below 200 beats per minute, we start talking and figure out what happened. This guy had purchased a brand new Camaro and drive it to this desolate stretch of road to open it up. He said 1 minute he's shifting gears, and the next thing he knows, his car is all over the road and his mouth was full of blood, and it seems like an explosion had gone off. I start looking at his injuries over and can't really see anything major, and ask him about the passenger in his car. He says, "What passenger?" "There's a lung in your back seat." The guy goes straight into a mental overload and can't come up with anything tangible. "Get him in the ambulance. Police are 5 minutes away. We potentially have another victim out here. I'm gonna have to go look by myself." I walk through the crash scene, look in the car, and sure enough, intestines wrapped around the gear shifter, lung in the back seat. Looks like parts of a liver. Looks like a hand grenade went off inside the car. I walk around the other side of the car and see a faint blood smear stain on the road. I walk to it see something else down the road, so I keep walking towards it. I finally saw something on the road and ran up to it as far as I could. Honestly, completely freaked out and scared to death about the body I was about to see. And then I realised the guy had hit a deer. What happened is, when he was winding the car out, the state police estimated he was well over 100 miles per hour. A deer jumped into his car's pathway and hit the top corner of the windshield with its stomach. When the windshield crashed out, it created a negative vacuum in the car, sucking almost all of the deer's organs out and into his car and all over him. I had the fire department decontaminate him, wrapped him up in some blankets and took him to the hospital. The sight of body parts splashed all around the car, and my imagination running 100 miles per hour really did stain this terrible moment into my brain forever. A few weeks ago, I rented a cabin near Pitkin County, Colorado, for a weekend getaway with my wife and daughter. For their privacy, I'll refer to my wife as Elena and my daughter, who's between 4 and 8 years old, as Sophia. It was dusk by the time we arrived at the cabin, far later than Elena and I had planned. The afternoon's anticipation gone, the promise of a relaxing vacation already sullied, and my back sore from changing the tyre which had popped by the forest road. The mood was thoroughly ruined. Maybe that should have been an indication as to how the rest of the trip would go. The cabin itself was beautiful and rustic, nestled among the towering pines. The 2-storey building blended into the surrounding woodlands, with its dark-stained wood siding and stone chimney. Large windows glistened with the last light of day, and the wraparound porch boasted a hanging patio swing, much to Sophia's delight. She ran straight for it and started swinging as Elena and I carried the bags inside. When I unlocked the door and turned the lights on, I found myself surprised by the decor. In stark contrast to the classy, almost minimalist exterior of the cabin, the interior was remarkably cluttered. It was like every square surface, countertops, bookshelves, tables, were covered in tiny little trinkets. There were coasters, candles, vintage oil lamps and compasses, a bunch of wooden animal carvings, each about a foot tall. The interior wasn't dirty by any means, just more crowded than I expected. I found it charming, in a weird way, though Elena was less fond. I remember her taking a long look at the place and saying, "Interesting," which is her code for, "I don't like what I'm seeing, but I'm also not going to make a big deal out of it." It was past Sophia's bedtime, so after coaxing her off of the porch swing, I helped her get set up for the night. There were 2 bedrooms on the second floor, a master suite with an attached bathroom, and a smaller bedroom that was pretty clearly set up as a kid's room for visitors to the cabin. The cabin was specifically advertised as family friendly and good for parents with younger children, so it was no surprise that the smaller room was full of colourful toys and plushies. There was a fireplace across from the bed, its mantle showcasing a full set of those wooden animal carvings. 1 moose, 1 bear, 1 trout, and so on. There was also 1 particularly large teddy bear sitting on the end of the bed, partially buried under the covers like it was getting ready to sleep. Sophia instantly fell in love, and I thought it was sweet that the cabin's owner had gone the extra mile to make the place more welcoming. I didn't love the idea of her cuddling it to sleep though, since it likely hadn't been washed between visits, so I propped it up on a chair next to the bed before tucking Sophia in for the night. Tired from our travels, Elena and I went to sleep not too long afterwards. Saturday was our designated lake day. After making breakfast and waking up Sophia, who had been convinced not to take her best friend, Mr. Bear, out on the water with us, we grabbed the kayaks off of our roof rack and headed down to the shore. We were a short walk away from the lake, and I was absolutely blown away by the natural splendour. Our cabin was semi-isolated, remote enough to give my family peace and privacy, but close enough to civilization that we could easily access help in the case of emergency. We were a 5-minute drive into town and 5-minute walk to the nearest neighbouring cabin, which we passed on our way to the lake. It was a gorgeous building, far more intricate and seemingly more older than the one we were staying in. There was an older woman sitting on the porch as we passed by, and although I couldn't wave since both hands were full with kayaks, I gave her a nod and a friendly smile. She stared at me in response, her expression completely blank.
She was looking directly at me, almost looking through me, but it looked like she was in some sort of trance. What was that all about? I asked Elena once we were out of earshot. Not sure. She looks pretty settled in there though. Maybe that's her home. She doesn't appreciate her neighbour running an Airbnb. That seemed like a logical explanation. I stole a quick glance over my shoulder before the house completely disappeared behind us, and saw that the woman who was now walking down the steps of her front porch, her gaze still fixed on us. Elena and I exchanged worried looks and picked up the pace a little bit, Sophia running along ahead of us, joyful and oblivious. Once we reached the shore, we hopped into the kayaks and pushed off further into the water. We weren't exactly running away from the woman. It was more so we wanted to avoid a confrontation, if we could. As we started paddling on the lake, the woman appeared at the tree line, but never came any closer. I gave her a wave, and again, she gave me no response, but a cold stare. It occurred to me that she might have been trying to warn us about the lake, but I'd researched the area extensively to make sure it was safe, and her demeanour wasn't quite urgent or benevolent enough for that to be the case. The rest of the day was thankfully devoid of any more strange encounters. After a day of swimming and hiking, we returned to the cabin in the evening for some dinner. Sophia brought Mr. Bear outside to help with the s'mores. To mine and Elena's amusement, we had no idea how we could convince her to leave the stuffed animal behind when we left on Monday night. After we put Sophia to sleep at 8 o'clock, Elena and I watched a movie, had a drink, and then went to sleep at 10:30 or so. At midnight, according to my phone clock, I heard what sounded like a knock. I sat up in bed, checked the time, and listened for a minute. A few seconds passed, and then came 3 knocks in quick succession. I gently shook Elena awake, waiting to hear the sound again, and after a moment, I did. There was someone at the front door of the cabin, in the middle of the night. Concerned, I got out of bed and tried to look out the bedroom window. I could only see a sliver of the front porch, and though I couldn't see an actual person, I could see the shadow of one, thanks to the porch lights. Needless to say, I wasn't thrilled to have a stranger pay our isolated cabin a midnight visit. I told Elena to stay upstairs and made my way to the first floor, stopping by the living room to pull back the curtains ever so slightly and peer through the windows. Still, given the shape of the house and the placement of the windows, it was impossible to see anything but a shadow. The person must have been standing an inch away from the front door. I scanned the front yard and the distant tree line, but didn't see anyone. So a decoy ambush situation seemed unlikely, but I still grabbed my handgun just in case. Just my luck, the old front door of the house didn't have a peephole, so I got up close to the door and tried talking to the person on the other end.
"Can I help you?"
I said. Instead of answering, the person knocked again, this time more urgently. No way in hell was I opening that door now.
"Look mate, if you need help you need to speak up, otherwise I'm going to have to ask you to get off my damn porch before I call the police."
The knocking stopped, and after a moment there was a woman's voice on the other side of the door. Her tone was nervous, and her voice was soft. She said a single sentence. He's watching your daughter through the bear." Of all the things I expected to hear from my unwelcome visitor, that was not one of them. I readied my gun and cracked the door open. When I looked out into the night, I saw the elderly woman from earlier quickly shambling away from the door. Her back was turned towards me, and she looked like she was trying to get away from my porch as quickly as she could. I called after her, asking her what she was talking about, but she didn't look back. She just kept going until the night swallowed her up completely. I was pretty disturbed at this point, obviously, so I shut and locked the door and made my way back upstairs. Elena was waiting for me at the top of the stairs, and I quietly explained to her what was going on. Horrified, she went into Sophia's room and gently took the teddy bear out of her sleeping daughter's arms. We went downstairs and laid the bear out on the kitchen counter. I grabbed a pair of kitchen shears and dissected the thing, making an incision in its fluffy body and pulling out its cotton innards. It wasn't that I believed the old woman, just that as a parent, anything related to my kid's safety, even something that sounds outlandish, is something I take seriously. Even though the woman was likely suffering from some kind of cognitive impairment, I still wanted to investigate. I pulled all the stuffing out of Mr. Bear and found nothing, though Elena pointed out that the bear had 2 very large glass eyes which could potentially be concealing a small camera. I was unable to find a hammer, but I did find a wrench under the kitchen sink. I wrapped the eyes in a kitchen towel and smashed them to bits, but when I sorted through the fragments, I didn't see anything that looked like a recording device. I was relieved, but I was also equal parts creeped out and angry. Maybe, like Elena had mentioned earlier, she was annoyed with the constant visitors to her neighbouring cabin and was trying to scare us off. She might have also had some mental health issues or hallucinations. In either case though, how did she know about the teddy bear? Maybe she'd visited the house before, or maybe it was just a lucky guess. Before returning to bed, I took a turn around both floors of the cabin, looking and failing to find anything out of the ordinary. Elena was also pretty freaked out, and she got up several times in the night to visit Sophia's room down the hall and make sure all was well. Needless to say, neither of us got much sleep that night. Sunday morning was all doom and gloom, which ended up being a perfect reflection of my daughter's attitude when she woke up and realised Mr. Bear was gone. Obviously we didn't tell her what had happened, but Elena and I did our best to distract her with flapjacks and promises of a fun day adventuring. Unfortunately, the plan we had hiked was foiled by a downpour that, of course, the forecasts hadn't predicted, and so we decided to salvage the day by exploring the small town nearby. It wouldn't be the escape into nature we had hoped for, but there were several small family-owned restaurants and shops in the area, as well as a library. The morning was alright. I enjoyed exploring the town with my family, although there wasn't much to do. We had an early lunch at around 11 or so, but when we sat down, my wife started rifling through her backpack with a look of dismay. When I asked her what was wrong, she said she didn't see Sophia's EpiPen, which we always like to have at the ready when we eat out. I realised immediately that I'd forgotten to put it back in Elena's backpack yesterday when I was reorganising our stuff. I felt like such an idiot, and Elena, already grouchy from a sleepless night, really chewed me out for it. To make amends, I told her to wait with Sophia at the restaurant while I hurried back to the cabin for the EpiPen. She was displeased, but it felt like a better option than all of us braving the rain to return back. The drive back was an absolute nightmare. Sure, it was a short commute, but the dirt roads leading to the cabin had turned to a sludge in the heavy rain. I was in a foul mood when I entered the cabin. I shut the front door with a slam and made my way up the stairs. The house was dark, thanks to the storm outside. Dark enough that I almost missed the muddy shoe prints leading up the hardwood stairs. When I saw them, I realised what they were. I stopped in my tracks. I didn't have to wonder what they meant. Someone had been in the cabin since my family left, and judging by the fact there was still only one set of prints, they were likely still in the house with me at that very moment. I stood on the half landing, looking up at the second half of the staircase. The upper floor was eerily dark, so much so that I thought someone could have been standing right at the edge of the staircase, and I wouldn't have a clue they were there. I carefully walked backwards down the stairs, keeping my eyes peeled in case any shape suddenly emerged from the darkness. And once I made it down, I turned around and ran outside. I sat in my car and called the police to report a break-in. After recalling Elena to explain the situation, I sat in my car and watched the house until the police arrived, which took an unreasonable amount of time. I never saw any movement from inside the house, nor did I see anyone leave, though I didn't have great visual on the back door. It's possible that the intruder could have slipped out through the back and ran straight into the woods, in which case the cabin would have obscured them. The police were shockingly dismissive about the whole thing. One of the officers who arrived on scene asked me for proof of a break-in, as if I'd had time to snap a picture of the intruder or the house or something like that. They did a sweep of the cabin and found no one inside, but even so, I didn't want my wife and daughter to step foot in that building again. I texted Elena, telling her I was going to pack up our stuff and that we should leave a night early. She agreed. The cops stayed with me as I packed to give me some peace of mind, which I appreciated. Aside from the shoe prints, there wasn't any obvious sign of a break-in, and strangely, nothing of value had been stolen, even though I'd left my laptop laying out in plain sight. Thankfully, we packed light, so it didn't take me long to grab all of our stuff from the master bedroom and the bathrooms. My last stop was Sophia's room, where I was quickly able to locate all of her stuff and pack up her bag. Nothing of Sophia's had been stolen or tampered with, but there was something missing from the fireplace mantle. Right in the centre, there was a circular impression in a fine layer of dust, indicating that a certain figurine had been recently separated from its wooden brethren. Someone had taken the bear. I deliver pizza, and I'd been having a really busy night, non-stop, back and forth, without any time to even pause and take a leak. I'd been so busy that I wasn't even really thinking about bathroom breaks. But we had also been going through a bit of a heat wave in our area, so I'd been drinking copious amounts of water. All of a sudden, as I was driving to this particular delivery, the urge to go hit me like a brick. Like, things went from 0 to 60 in an instant. Thankfully, I was close to the customer, so I could get this one over with quickly. Or, so I thought. I pulled up to the house, and it was in an area that I'd delivered in before. So I could immediately see that something wasn't right. All the lights were off in the house, not even the glow of a television or anything. It was extra apparent because the street light closest to the door happened to be out of order. And on top of all of that, the block was dead quiet. This is a big university area, and obviously there aren't many student renters in July. But there had to be at least one person, because someone ordered this pizza. Maybe they just liked sitting in the dark, or they were out in the backyard, whatever. I just didn't want to get out of my car and knock on a quiet house in the middle of the night without first checking that I had the correct address and the customer was inside. It was around 9:30, but it was still scorching, even after sundown. My car's AC is a joke, and the piping hot pizzas don't help things much, so I try and open the car door as infrequently as possible to keep any cool air in. I called the number that the customer provided, and the voice on the other side said,
Yeah?
I just tried to keep it clear and concise.
Hey, is your pizza out front, but there doesn't appear to be anybody home?
And the customer replied, still gasping for air.
Yeah, I'm not home.
I had to pee so badly by that point that I was much less patient than I'd otherwise be with a customer right out of the gate.
Well, then you're going to have to terminate the order, because I've arrived in the stated delivery window and you're supposed to pay in cash. So I don't know what to tell you, mate, but plan ahead next time.
I instantly regretted letting my bladder do the talking for me, as the voice on the other end came through more clearly as a young, bubbly and very distraught girl who couldn't have been older than 20 or 25.
Oh, God, I'm so sorry. I'm running down the street. I can barely hear you.
She cried.
I just switched you out of AirPods. Is that better? Sorry. I completely lost track of time, but I knew you were coming. That's why I'm literally running home right now. Please don't leave. I'm starving and I don't have a car. Seriously, please don't leave. 5 minutes tops, okay?
I know what it's like to be hungry and running late and have no car but not live near any restaurants. Plus, when I heard her voice, I began to remember more specifically having delivered to this place a couple of times before, and she had always been perfectly nice. Now I just felt bad for snapping at her. I tried to walk it back while simultaneously looking out my window for potential spots to pee.
No, my bad. I'm letting the heat get to me. It's not your fault. Look, there's no need to rush. See you when you get here.
I hung up, and while surveilling the street, was starting to think I was really out of luck. All the other houses had people in them, and were so close together, so there were no clumps of trees or any out-of-the-way patches of land or anything. Of course, I just tossed my empty water bottle back at the last delivery, because I'm an idiot. Finally, I decided it was escalating to the point of an emergency, and the safest bet was to use a bush in front of the woman's house. She wasn't home. The streetlight was out, so no one would see me. The people who were at home were inside. My car was parked across the street, and we're a small shop who don't wear uniforms, so if someone did spot me, they'd have no way to connect me to my employer. Animals piss outside all the time. Humans are animals, so this is fine. I guess. I scurried over to the tallest bush in her front yard. She didn't really have much of a yard, to be honest, more just a walkway lined with bushes and flowers that ran adjacent to her front door. The biggest cluster of bushes, the only one where I could be sure there'd be no visible splatter on the side of the house, was about 3 feet from the door. I looked both ways, unzipped, and let fly. After the initial millisecond of relief, I noticed the sound was way off, more like pissing on something solid than something leafy. I started panicking, thinking I'd aimed wrong, but once I start, I can't stop midstream, so I kept squinting into the darkness to see if I was maybe hitting a key rock or something and could just move a few inches over. Instead, all of a sudden, I heard a way more concerning noise. A deep voice, exclaiming,
"What the fuck?"
And before I could turn around, assuming I'd been caught by a neighbour, a man came leaping out of the bushes. He blew by me, brushing my golden shower off him as he did. He spit onto the ground, so I think I must have beamed him right in the face. I didn't see where he went after a few paces, but, though this next part is kind of a blur, I do think I remember hearing a car screech out from a bit further away after a minute. I'd gotten some night vision by that point, so I was able to make out his height, build and outfit, but only the most general details of each. I was in such a shock that I didn't even put my dick away. I just stood there, trying to figure out what had happened. The reality was so terrifying that my mind refused to accept it and impulsively searched for a reasonable explanation that could make everything okay. I thought, could these bushes lead to some backyard area and just look like they were against her house? Could there be an obscuring an open window? My inner voice was desperately screaming. That man was wearing a hoodie in 90-degree weather. That was a bad man. You're in a bad situation. But the very idea that I was within inches of a guy that would be hiding in bushes at all, let alone in front of a young woman's house at night, just wasn't something I was ready to grapple with yet. I was coping by not coping. My fight or flight response totally failed me at that point, because my dumbass did the absolute last thing I should have done and approached the bushes to try and validate this. There must have been a good reason for a man in a hoodie to hide behind bushes in the middle of the night, theory. So I walked over to the side and turned on my phone flashlight and tried to peer around the line of shrubbery. Pro tip, as scary as things may look in the dark, seeing them with a single beam of your flashlight can sometimes make it even worse. That's when I saw the bag. There was a tattered drawstring bag sitting behind the bushes, slightly splashed with piss. But I was in such a moronic daze from shock that I groped around for it thinking, see, this is it, this is explain why he was back here. It explained it alright, it definitely did. Once I manoeuvred it over and pulled it open, I saw a sharp knife, a roll of duct tape and a bottle of pills. The delusions officially broke at that point, and all the adrenaline, endorphins and self-preservation instincts that had been suppressed kicked in 10 times over. I became whatever the fuck the opposite of dazed is, more laser focused than I'd ever been in my life, with one singular goal: get back to my car. I dropped the bag, booked it across the street, got in my car and slammed the pedal to the floor before the door was even closed. I went as far as I could, as fast as I could, until I hit a red signal. Then I pulled off to the side and realised I shouldn't be driving any more than necessary in the condition I was in. I pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour drugstore and took a breath. I was finally calm and coherent enough to zip up and formulate a plan of action. My first lucid thought was, who do I call? The police or the girl whose house that was? I thought about it for what could have been more than 10 seconds, but it felt like an hour, and decided, okay, I'm in a locked car with the engine running. If trouble starts, I can drive away. I know something's up. She might not. She needs to know not to keep walking in that direction. But as I was dialing her number, it occurred to me, what if there was no girl? I thought I remembered delivering to that house before, but what if I was wrong? What if the girl on that phone was just a decoy to get me there, to rob me, or even worse? Every pizza guy on the planet has seen the Evil Genius documentary by now, so I thought, she called me out of breath. She wasn't home. The whole thing was off. I can't risk it. I'll start with the cops. I called 911. The operator was very helpful in keeping me calm, because I was a complete wreck by this point. He kept assuring me that someone would be there soon. I kept telling them that they had to get there before the girl did, but I was trying to express 3 thoughts at once, and really damaging my own credibility. Finally, they basically just asked me to stop talking and stay on the line, but that was when I saw an incoming call from the customer. I couldn't answer it without disrupting my 911 call, so I just ignored it. But then she sent me this text.
Hey, I'm here. I don't see you.
I told 911 that she was there, and they said the officers were only minutes away. But who knows how long that meant. especially after I'd given such a scattered account about the events in my panic. I just felt overwhelmed with guilt, because my rational mind said the odds of her being a decoy for some large scam targeting pizza guys was low, and the odds of her being the intended victim of a predator was high. So I put my call to the police on mute and turned back, heart absolutely pounding out of my chest. Then I took 911 off mute and told them I'd return to look for the girl. They weren't happy about that, but I saw her meandering past the parked cars in the street, looking to see if one was mine, and I waved her down, flashing my brights. She bounced on over to the window of my car, happy-go-lucky. I figured that was a good sign that she wasn't in on whatever this was, but I just looked so scared to be back in the general area, and to not know what had happened, or what was going to happen. I kept whispering, "Get in, get in," and she was like, "Get in. You want me to get the pizza from the back?" I didn't want to make the same mistake with her that I made with the police, so instead of trying to tell her the whole story, I stuck to the bare basic facts. "There was a man in your bushes. I'm on the phone with the police. I don't know where he is right now. Please get in the car so we can lock the doors." I was barely able to even get those sentences out. It was a miracle I said it coherently. I was shaking like I had 10 cups of black coffee. I held up my phone with 911 on the call screen to verify it for her. I thought that's why she got in the car with no further explanation, but it turns out that wasn't entirely true.
You still there? Is she with you? Are you safe? Is anyone else there?
911 kept checking in. Not knowing who the third party I was talking to was, I reassured them and we drove, more cautiously this time, to a location the police instructed us to wait at. I didn't actually have much to do after that. The police came pretty soon after. A car met us. I gave a statement telling them everything I observed, and she went to go speak to more officers in more detail than they needed me for. It turns out the reason she got in the strange pizza guy's car without probing any deeper into my story is because she knew who the man was, right away, from my description. She had an abusive ex-boyfriend who was apparently psychotic enough that he immediately came to mind when hearing, "There's a guy in your bushes." She later called up the business to thank me and insist on leaving me a huge tip. I wasn't there when the call came in, so the kid who answered didn't know how to refuse money. But the manager already promised the next time we see her, we can load her up with enough 1 free pie cards to last a lifetime. Easily the scariest thing that has ever happened to me, on the job or off. I don't get the chance to tell this story much, because I try to avoid sharing it with anyone who could possibly know the girl or know the event, but I'm still not the same since. Even though I know he didn't have anything to do with me directly, this truly struck me to my core. So, man in the bushes, let's not meet.
Although it doesn't seem like it, this happened quite a while back, probably over 10 years ago now. I was in the later years of high school and was home alone. My parents were at a wedding that required them to stay at a hotel, and my brother worked a night shift. At that time, my family lived in a very well-known East Coast city in a blue-collar neighbourhood that was starting to make a nosedive. As a teenager, I was a bit of a loner. I wasn't a nerd or anything. I was a big dude who had friends and went on dates, but I'm a natural introvert, so I cherished the rare alone time that I got. This weekend I was looking forward to engaging in my normal empty house routine, play some PlayStation on the big TV screen, then order a late takeout dinner and pig out while watching some Dragon Ball Z. Then, around 2 AM, fall asleep on the couch with my old dog, Cecil. Cecil was a beagle who was as old as the hills and had been in our family for about 8 years. He was quiet and peaceful and spent his time begging for food or sleeping. Unlike most beagles, Cecil never howled or barked. He was more than content to rest his head on your lap and spend the night there. Anyway, back to the story. It's approximately 1 AM and I had just finished the last slice of pizza and was dozing off on the couch when I heard a bang coming from the back alley. I didn't think much of it. Anyone who has lived in the city knows noises happen at almost all moments of the night. Cecil's head popped up off my lap and then the hair on the back of his head stood up. He was always a bit skittish, so I calmed him down and started dozing off again. Not more than 2 minutes later, I hear another bang, and Cecil did something I'd never seen him do before. He leapt off the couch and ran like the wind towards the door leading to the basement, barking and growling like a dog twice his size. The look on his face reminded me of a German Shepherd K9 unit. I'd never seen him like that before, which got my adrenaline pumping. Through the dog's barking, I can now make out a persistent banging. There was a seldom used door in the basement that led to our back alley. It was old and rusted and was hard to open, even with a key, and it made a lot of noise. I suddenly realised that someone was trying to break into my house through that basement door. Quick little bit of context for anyone who hasn't lived in a bad neighbourhood. If someone tries to get into your house and moves on after they realise the door is locked, they want your stuff. If someone is persistently trying to get into your house despite the door being locked, well, they want you. Knowing this, I rushed upstairs to grab the heavy wooden baseball bat that I keep under my bed for situations like this. Then I head down to my basement. I probably should have run, but I was a macho teenager with a tough guy complex, plus I had nowhere to go anyway. While I'm heading down the stairs to my basement, Cecil blows past me with the speed and aggression of a dog half his age. Suddenly, I hear a man's voice say, "Oh fuck," and the banging stopped. I didn't call the cops or anyone else, which was probably the dumbest thing I've ever done. I just sat up for the rest of the night with my bat in hand. My brother came home that morning and I told him what had happened. We went to the basement door to take a look, and when we gave it a tug to open it, the whole door fell off. This psycho was one good shove away from getting into my house, but old Cecil scared him off. I'm sure that lazy fat old dog saved my life. When I tell this story to people, they dismiss his actions as a dog doing what a dog was supposed to do. But when I tell you that Cecil never barked or moved as fast as that in his life, you can take that to the bank. It was almost like he knew the urgency, like he knew that door was going to give. A few years back, we had to have him put down because he just had no will to live anymore. Before the injection, I got a moment alone with him. I thanked him one last time for his friendship and for what he did for me that night. At this point, I was a grown man with a wife and kids, and I'm convinced none of that would have ever happened without good old Cecil. Thanks, pal. I miss you every day. My name is Corey. Not Corey with a Y or Corey with an EY. Corey with just an I. A usually feminine spelling of a name for a guy. Not that I mind much of what spelling or so on of what my parents actually gave me. A few years ago I'd just been let go from my first job out of college. It'd been pretty good money, but the company went under, so I started applying to every job I could find. Indeed, Monster, even Craigslist. One Craigslist job in particular was based on the outskirts of the city I lived, but I was ready to take anything. The job in question was some basic data entry and assistant work. At least that's what the job listing said. It was a pretty basic website in retrospect, but the company message seemed to make it sound like they were heavily about serving the city and facilitating volunteer work. Within minutes of applying, I got a response inviting me for an interview that same day, though it titled me as a Miss Corey. I was going to respond to correct them, but it read like it was an automated response, so there'd be no one to read it or reply to me. I figured I'd just have to correct them once I got there, and again, it didn't really seem like a big deal. I'd gotten this once or twice before in the past. I drove to the location the website had listed, and it didn't seem too out of the ordinary. It was on the second floor of a small building that was sandwiched in between a pawn shop and a phone store. I didn't think too much of it because this was a big city, and even if this was on the outskirts, a job was a job. I looked up to the second floor on the outside and saw someone looking down at me. I couldn't make out the face, but it was a person. That much I'm sure of. I went inside of the building and took the elevator up to the second floor and didn't find a single soul. It looked like a half-finished office floor from what I remember, with some doors opened and some locked shut, but there was just simply no one to speak to, no one to inform that I'd arrived. There was one cubicle, but one of the detachable walls had been left in another office room. There was a computer monitor in one room, but no desktop attached to it. A half-finished company banner and a bookcase. On closer inspection of the bookcase, all the books weren't books at all, but a cardboard printing of a bunch of books stacked together. I finally had too much and called the phone number that had been on the website, but I heard no phone ringing from where I stood. More so, the phone I called seemed to cut off after a ring and a half, sending me straight to voicemail.
Sufficiently creeped out by now, or wondering if I had stumbled on something I shouldn't have, I took the elevator down. As the elevator doors closed, I heard someone muttering angrily. I thought that was a girl's name. I didn't want to stay and find out who it was. Instead, I walked right back to my car and drove back home, not even daring to look back at the window of the floor I was sure I had been scheduled for. That very evening, out of morbid curiosity, I checked Craigslist. The posting was gone. I looked for the website. It had been disabled. To this day, I still wonder what or who did I stumble upon. My greatest regret is not calling the police about this. Amanda is my brother's girlfriend. At the time of this story, she was looking for her first apartment and moving out from her parents' house. Her and my brother didn't want to move in together since they'd only been dating for a few months. She opted instead to search for a roommate online. Browsing Craigslist, she found an ad titled something like "Roommate Wanted, Female Only." This sort of thing was common since the area she was looking in was mostly young professionals. The listing was for a room in a house for about $225 a month, which was quite cheap compared to most places listed. The occupant listed herself as a 23-year-old college student that wasn't comfortable with living with any men. The other roommates would have their own room and attached bathroom. So far, Amanda was into this place. However, the listing only had a single photo from the outside of the property. Amanda sent an email wanting to meet the occupant and tour the house. Within 30 minutes, she received an email back with all the details and a time to stop by. The girl worked late hours and Amanda wanted to stop by at 8 PM. When she arrived, there's a handwritten note on the front door saying, "Door broken, use back door." Walking around the house, it looks nice but slightly unkempt. Tall grass, weeds, dusty windows. Still, no alarms for Amanda though. When she knocks on the back door, an older man opens it. At first Amanda thinks she has the wrong house, but the man reassures her and says that the occupant was out and he was the landlord. The occupant asked him to meet Amanda since she was working late. He seemed pleasant and offered to show her around. Alarms start going off, but aren't at red alert yet. First, the guy, clearly in his 40s, unshaven and looked like he lived in his car. Also, only the kitchen light was on. As they walked around the house, Amanda noticed one huge red flag. No furniture. Nothing. The landlord was polite about answering questions, but seemed irritable to keep the lights on for too long, rushing her around, only letting her look at the rooms for a few moments. There was a single room that the landlord wouldn't open, telling her that it was the occupant's room and he didn't want to invade her privacy. As they walked down the hallway into the living room, she notices the front door has a plank nailed across it. Amanda's creepometer is starting to ding, so she decides to wrap it up and leave, but trying to be polite. As she's giving the guy her "thanks for showing me" bit, he perks up and states that he forgot to show her the basement. It's been recently furnished and would be a great rec room, and she should take a look down there. At the time, Amanda and the landlord are standing in a small hallway between the front living room and the back kitchen. In this little hallway was the basement door. When he opens it, it opens outward to create something of a barrier between Amanda and the back door. The basement's pitch black. He smiles, motions down the stairs, and says,
"Ladies first."
What happens next is nothing more than a stroke of luck. Amanda gets a text just as some random person parks in front of the house. Thinking on her feet, she pretends it's a phone call and answers it.
Hey, yeah, are you here? I'll come out from round back and let you in. It's great, you have to see it.
With a motion of confidence, she excuses herself around the landlord and walks out the back door. She says the guy just looked at her like he was confused. Once outside, she sprinted to the car and sped the hell out of there. When Amanda got home, she told her mother and my brother everything. Cops were called, they took her statement and went to investigate. The Craigslist post had been deleted as soon as she left. The house had been foreclosed over 6 months earlier and the property had been abandoned. When the police investigated, they found the closed room the landlord didn't want her to look in is where the man had been staying. There was a pile of old dirty blankets, rotten food and empty gallon jugs everywhere. The creepiest bit is he had plastered up ripped pages from porno mags all over the walls. The really scary part was the basement. The man had tied a thin piece of fishing twine about shin level across the stairs about halfway down. The basement was empty, except another old pile of blankets, a broom handle wrapped in leather belts, and a small box with a few rolls of sorted tape. You'll be surprised to know, Amanda ended up not moving in. When I was 21, I transferred to a college in San Francisco. I checked out a room for rent on Craigslist. It was in a really nice 2-bedroom apartment. It was cheap rent and close to campus, so it was the ideal spot. The girl who lived there was 29, and her name was Beth. She was tall and wide. She had jet black hair and wore pale makeup. She seemed nice, although a little bit quiet, but she seemed to like me and agreed to let me move in. So far, so good. My first night there, we went out for pizza, and that's when I could tell something was a little bit off with her. Throughout dinner, she kept telling me how much I looked like Shia LaBeouf. I didn't know what to say, so I just shrugged it off with a thanks. I mean, I looked nothing like Shia LaBeouf, so it didn't really make any sense to me. When I got back home, she'd asked me if I'd seen her room yet. I said no, and she took me up to see it. Her walls were covered in posters of Shia LaBeouf. She even had printed out photos of him all over her mirror. She owned all his movies. I didn't know what to make of it. It was creepy. The whole night she'd been saying I looked like him, and now it's obvious to me. She's obsessed with the guy. A few weeks passed, and I never really saw her that much. We didn't spend much time together really. She'd come home from work and practically run to her room. She'd spend the whole night in there. She had this creepy, high-pitched giggle, and I'd hear her giggling through the walls all night. I wondered what the fuck she could possibly be doing. Occasionally she'd come out to talk for like 2 minutes, and she'd be slurring her words, so I suspected she was drinking a lot. Sometimes she wouldn't say anything, and she would just stand in the hallway and watch me in the living room. I would turn and see her and be surprised and say, "Hello, Beth," and then there'd be this long, awkward pause, and she'd give out a creepy high-pitched giggle. It was uncomfortable being around her. She gave me the chills. One night, I woke up at around 2 AM because I heard what sounded like the front door being unlocked. I came out my bedroom and all the lights were off, but I could still see Beth standing at the front door. She had her face against it, and she was turning the lock back and forth over and over again. Every time she turned the bolt, she mumbled my name. Max Barker, Max Barker, Max Barker. Seeing her standing in the dark and mumbling my name obviously freaked me out, and it doesn't help that she kinda looks like a bigger version of the girl from The Ring. I just quietly went back to my room and tried to get some sleep. One night I was watching Gladiator, and she stumbled out of her room and turned on the living room light, forcing me to pause the movie, which was annoying. She then asked me if I wanted to hear about her ex-boyfriend. It was an uneasy segue into the topic, but I just said sure, and then awkwardly sat back and listened to her. 10 minutes into the story, and she was so riled up. She was screaming at the top of her lungs about their breakup. I was worried the neighbours were going to call the cops, and she wasn't listening to me when I asked her to lower the volume. Amidst all of her screaming, one thing she said really freaked me out. She was in such a fit and yelled, "I'll slit his fucking throat." That was a big game changer. Suddenly I had no idea what this girl was capable of. She was practically a stranger, and everything I'd seen was becoming alarmingly disturbing. After a few more minutes, she told me thanks for listening, and she started doing her giggle. I got out of there pretty fast and went to my room to go to sleep. I had a pretty unsettling feeling about being in the house with her, and what's worse is there's no lock on my bedroom door. I pushed the edge of my dresser in front of it to act as a little barricade. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of my dresser scraping against the floor. Beth was pushing the door open. I turned on the light, shouting at her to stop. I could see her through the opening of the door. She was drunk, so drunk, and had this insane look in her eyes. I pushed the door closed and yelled to her to go to bed. I could hear her walk back to her room, but I couldn't fall back asleep. The next morning when I went out to the hallway, my heart dropped. I saw one of her steak knives on the floor by my door. I got goosebumps all over my arms. All I could think about was her saying that she would slit that guy's throat. I confronted her about it, and she said she didn't remember anything. She said she didn't even remember telling me about her ex. I had enough. My lease was month to month, so I found a new spot and moved out. About a month after I moved out, she contacted me. I was at the movies and my phone was off. When I got out, I turned it on, and to my shock, I'd received about 40 text messages, all over the course of 2 fucking hours. They were all just insane texts that ranged from everything between, "Hi, how are you?" to, "I fucking hate you." It was insane. I didn't even respond, and I never heard from her again. I always wonder, if I hadn't sat my dresser in front of that door, would she have come in quietly and slit my throat? Who knows, but it still freaks me out. My name's Tom, and I live in the St. Louis area, and this is a horror story about something that happened to me that almost fucked up my life forever. When I was 21 years old, I broke up with my first ever serious girlfriend, who I'd been together with for almost 8 months. Needless to say, I was devastated. I fell into a deep depression, and I began abusing painkillers and Xanax really heavily. I began looking for any chick I could find to rebound with. I ended up looking on the personal section on Craigslist, and I found an ad for a girl named Stephanie. I started talking to her, and I arranged for her to come pick me up. On that night we had intercourse, and decided to make it a regular thing. She was an older lady, about 35, and a bigger girl, but she had her own apartment and enough money to keep me loaded on as much drugs and alcohol as I could stand. To be honest, I kinda used this lady. After a while she grew really attached to me, and started to want a more serious relationship. Eventually, she started dropping hints about wanting to get married. She said she wanted to do this to help me out, so she could get me on her insurance, so I could get help for my drug and alcohol problem, which obviously I refused to consider. One day we got in a big argument, and she told the police that I'd been abusing her, and got a temporary restraining order on me. A week after she did this, she called me crying her eyes out, saying please forgive me, I love you, and all this other bollocks. She said she wanted me to come pick her up, get some dope, some alcohol, get something to eat, and being the addict I am, of course I accepted. From the moment she picked me up, I noticed that she was acting kind of odd. She was usually really talkative, and was always on my arse wanting to talk to me about this and that, but on this day, she was oddly quiet. When we got back to her apartment, after I walked in, she immediately pushed me on the couch and pulled my pants down and began giving me head, and she climbed on top of me and began riding me, and she seemed angry when I didn't come inside her. I'd been getting bad vibes off her the whole night, so after this happened, I immediately asked her for a ride back home, which she quickly agreed to. After I got dropped off at the house, I went inside and sat down with my sister and watched some SpongeBob. A strange turn of events, I'm aware. About 10 minutes later, I was home and got a call on the phone. I picked it up, and to my surprise the lady on the other end said that this is the St. Louis County Police Department, and we're going to need you to come outside to talk to you. I ran downstairs and hid my weed and my pills, then walked outside to figure out what the hell was going on. There were about 7 different cops on my porch, and they were all pointing tasers and guns at me. One of them hit me in the back of my legs with a nightstick and put me on the ground. I was handcuffed. The cops then talked to my mum and got permission to go inside of the house. They took a drug dog and began doing a thorough search of my room and the basement area. None of the cops on the scene would tell me what the fuck was going on. Whenever I'd ask a question, they'd just ignore me. The only response they gave me is that I'd have a chance to tell my story to the detective at the station. When I got to the police station, I had a bombshell dropped on me. Apparently this lady had accused me of kidnapping her and abusing her. She told the police that she'd come by my house to return some of my stuff because we'd just broken up, and that I had come out with a knife and held it to her throat and forced my way into her vehicle, took her back to her apartment and done awful things. Thankfully, I'd remembered that we'd made a couple of stops on the way to her apartment. She had gone inside of a gas station to get a couple of packs of cigarettes with me, so there was no way I could have kidnapped her. The police still swabbed my dick for DNA and also took my clothes for evidence, and I was forced to spend the night in the St. Louis County Jail, wearing nothing but hospital scrubs. I was released the next morning, but my ordeal was far from over. The lady began constantly stalking me. She'd call me every night at odd times from blocked numbers, and either crying into the phone or just begging to talk to me. I also began seeing her vehicle quite a lot in the neighbourhood, even though she lives nowhere close to me. I called the police about this a couple of times, but they didn't really seem to give a shit. I wanted nothing to do with the court system though, because I had a criminal record and I just wanted to ignore her and hope the problem would go away. After a couple of months, she finally did stop bothering me. However, still to this day, sometimes I get a call at 2 or 3 in the morning from a blocked number, and every new girlfriend I get, she messages them on Facebook and tells them what I apparently done to her. Moral of the story is, be careful who you meet online. Whether you're a guy or a girl, all it takes is one crazy person to completely ruin your life. I'd gotten used to checking Craigslist before buying anything new, so when my ice cream maker died, I headed right there. I found the one I wanted. It was new in the box, and emailed to see if it was still available. For some reason, I assumed I was talking to a woman, and we made plans to meet up. I'd gotten sort of used to the carelessness about always meeting in public, and agreed to come to her house, believing that she had several small children, which made it difficult to leave home. I was supposed to go after work, and we switched to text messages so they could text the address, and so I could let them know when I was on my way. I got home, and they texted me the address. My normal routine at this point would be to hop in the car and use the GPS to find it, but since I had booted up my PC while waiting, I just decided to use Google Maps. I typed in the address and it showed a registered sex offender. Violent sex offender. I googled the phone number and the same person came up. I let them know I was not coming, went to Walmart and spent $5 more to buy it there. So, Mr. Sex Offender, who tried to lure me with ice cream, let's not meet.
I decided to treat my wife to a vacation for her birthday. We don't have kids, have a moderately stable income, and love to travel. She told me to surprise her. She only had one requirement: a hot tub. Well, finding a place within 2 weeks on Airbnb with a hot tub seemed to prove its own challenge. I checked Charleston, Myrtle Beach and Virginia. Then I thought to myself, Tennessee, the Great Mountains. All those cabins always have a hot tub. So I went ahead and did a search on Airbnb and found a place with damn near perfect reviews. A few 4 stars here or there, but no complaints. I booked it while at work and kept it a secret until we drove there. We arrived and passed through a beautiful gate. We drove up a driveway that was 2 miles long. It took us roughly 15 minutes to do that because of all the blind curves. When we punched in the code and walked in, we fell in love. The place was absolutely gorgeous. I plopped down onto the couch and took off my shoes, while she went to use the restroom before we dipped into the hot tub. I reached for the TV remote and noticed a paper underneath it. I figured it was a tub guide or something, but it wasn't. Greetings, guest. We hope you enjoy your stay in this cabin. For the best possible experience, please follow these rules closely. We ask you this to ensure your safety and survival. Please step inside before midnight. Under no circumstances do you walk outside. Be sure all doors are locked. If the man in the hood approaches, speak to him only if he speaks to you first. Don't leave food outside. Cabins normally say this because bears, but you don't want to feed them. Before you leave in the morning, please leave us a positive review. Doing this will give you the code to leave the gate in the morning. I didn't tell my wife because, well, she's a scaredy cat. And I didn't want to upset her, and I kind of figured it was some sort of joke a housekeeper left. Still, I'm a pretty paranoid person. We hopped in the hot tub and had a couple of beers, and I must say, it felt amazing. Being butt naked in warm water staring out at the moon and stars over the mountain made me feel serenity. But I noticed it was 10 till midnight. Not trying to scare my wife, I asked her if we could go inside and make some cookies before putting on a movie. As we walked in, I locked the back door and casually checked the front. We baked the chocolate chip cookies and put on some kung fu movie before she fell asleep on me. I was on the border of slipping into sleep myself when I heard. I walked up to the door and peered out the side window.
Mr. Boyles, I know you're in there. Please, let's have a chat. Aren't you going to answer, Mr. Boyles? I can smell you through the door, and I can see your shadow casting through the window.
I finally made sense of what the knocking was, and it was a very pale man in a dark robe. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could see his cracked old mouth. What do you want from me?
Ah, Mr. Boyles, how very smart of you to answer back.
I'm not really the man for small talk, so let me cut straight to the point. I'm very hungry, and so are my children. May we come in?
No, sir, you cannot.
Oh, what a shame. How about you search in the freezer and give me some of that hamburger meat the owner's left?
Okay, 1 second. You'll leave me alone after this, yeah? I asked.
You have my word. You can even slide the tray through the mouse slot.
I walked up to the fridge and opened the freezer door. A note was in there with no meat. If you want to keep your hand, do not slide in any food. Oh no. I walked back and told him I had nothing for him.
Mr. Boyles.
The hooded man walked away and my wife woke up and asked why I was so pale. Before I could think of a lie, the chanting started. I peered out of the window and saw what seemed to be 8 smaller hooded men. They were circling our cabin and chanting. I couldn't quite make out what they were saying because I was shaking so hard.
Mr. Boyles, I'm back and I brought company. Kindly open the door so this can all end.
All of them started pounding on the windows and doors. My wife was crying hysterically. My senses overloaded. I grabbed the handgun I laid on the nightstand and put it against my head. I just wanted it to stop. All the noise. I was hypnotised. Right before I pulled the trigger, all the little men did this high-pitched scream. I fired the round after my hand jerked and it went through the TV and stopped by the chimney. My wife had tackled me and covered my ears. She knew how bad noises bothered me and wrapped a blanket around us both. I don't remember falling asleep, but I remember the sun being up and I saw where muddy footprints were stomped all over the car. I wrote a positive review and received the code to leave, so if anyone is planning to go to the Great Mountains, be wary of the hooded man. Honestly, I don't know. Maybe he was trying to be nice, but every red flag was raised and every alarm inside me was going crazy. This happened a few hours ago and I'm safe now. I don't think I have anything to worry about anymore. I'm going to another country to see a band I love. I found a cheap Airbnb online and booked it. I was supposed to come in late last night, but the flight was delayed, train missed, a nightmare trip overall. I was supposed to get to his place after midnight, and he told me that was completely fine. I checked the reviews about him, and all that was said is that he was a lovely host, a really nice man. But I did notice that all these reviews had been written within a month. Red flag number 1. Then I missed the final train and was unable to get to the place, so I told him I couldn't make it, but will be there tomorrow, and he said it was okay. I got to the train station of the city I'm in and decided to walk because I hadn't had that much cash with me. I walked for about 40 minutes and got to a place that could be called run down at best. I see drug dealers everywhere. You can just tell sometimes. The door, which had the right number on it, was just a white door next to a shop. Red flag number 2, 3 and 4. I'd never been able to get hold of him. I had his number, but it always went to an answering machine and he didn't answer my texts. I walk into a shop and ask if someone lives there, and the guy in his shop was shady, and he said, "A few. Who are you looking for?" I tell him my host's name, and he was playing with his phone in a way I couldn't see anything of what he was doing, but then there was a bing. I get a message from my host. He's almost there. I leave the shop and realise that was red flag number 5. Half an hour later, a guy comes in the car with his girl in the front seat and says, "I'm your host. It's the wrong address on the site. Hop in the back and I'll take you there." Red flag number 6. I said, "You know what, thank you, but I'll find somewhere else." And I walked away. Now, that doesn't really seem like a horror story, does it? However, in the coming weeks, I saw something pop up on social media. It was an Instagram post about someone else's horror story, which linked to another horror story, all described in the same Airbnb, pretty much the same details, some varying in slight different ways. In the comments, someone had posted that their daughter had stayed at this man's Airbnb. The daughter had messaged the mother at 5 minutes to 7. She arrived at the Airbnb just shy of 7 o'clock, and those were her last known whereabouts. This happened a few months ago. If I remember correctly, in January or February 2024, I was visiting family in southern France and did not want to stay at their place even if they offered, for personal reasons which I won't share here. Note that I visit them quite often and usually last minute, so I'd never book the same place and sometimes book a hotel which was more expensive but better for me because I don't necessarily want to socialise with the hosts. Even when I would book Airbnbs, I would always search flats or studio flats and not a room in a flat or a house where other people live, as I want to be on my own, so this is important criteria for me. So I booked this Airbnb within walking distance to where my family members stay, and it looks very nice on paper. I think it was marketed as a house or a ground floor flat with access to a yard and a garden. It was probably one of the cheaper options. There were not a lot of reviews, but the few ones that were there were pretty positive. So I go to that place with my suitcase, waiting in front of the house. I contact the landlord who should give me the keys, but he's late. I spent at least 1 hour waiting outside, and I'm trying to be patient, realising at least the neighbourhood is pretty nice and seems safe, even if I did have to walk through areas that were slightly dodgy to get there. The landlord finally arrives. He seems like a good man and apologises profusely, saying that he was in another town visiting his cousin or friends, and time flew by. First red flag, he says they were drinking and didn't have time to sober up, so he had to speed on the highway on his motorbike while being drunk. He stops and asks me half jokingly not to say that in my review. I get a bit serious and tell him he shouldn't drink and drive, but he says he didn't really want to make me wait any longer. I tell him I won't flag that in my review, although I probably will, but I don't want to get off on the wrong foot. This guy is nice otherwise and seems trustworthy, very chatty and open to socialising, and frankly I was just happy I could finally get in and drop off my stuff. Second red flag is when he tells me I'll be living in a small flat adjacent to the bigger house where he lives. But I shouldn't worry because I have my own place, my own bathroom, my own kitchen, etc, etc. I don't like that too much, but I actually think it might be good because I'm not super comfortable being on my own in a ground floor accommodation, knowing anyone can get into the yard and access the front door. So knowing that someone that I know is close by in case something happens gives me a sense of safety. He shows me around. All seems okay. It's pretty old, but as I said, I wasn't looking for a luxury stay. The part where I would stay is on a lower level than street level. Not exactly like a basement, because there is access to a garden, but I need to walk down a set of stairs outside and get into the flat through the backyard. This shows mostly when I'm in the bedroom, as I see through the windows that it's clearly at a lower level. Next red, or rather yellow flag, is when he shows me a door close to his bedroom, which is the connecting door between my part and his part of the house. I was kind of expecting that, but thought he might need to at least cross the yard or access through the front door to get to my part of the house. He says this door stays closed and is locked anyway, not as a warning for me to try and open it, but more like you'll notice there is this door. It's useless for you and what's beyond it is not what you're renting. We chat a little bit and he gives me his phone number because Airbnb chat feature is not too good, it's easier to use WhatsApp. And then he leaves. I start to settle down, open my suitcase and get changed before leaving to visit my family. I then went back to the place in the evening and decided to have a shower. If I remember correctly, what I'm saying next happened before I took a shower, because I remember locking the bathroom door, which I never do when I'm on my own, and I recall being quite anxious when taking a shower. It's the biggest red flag before the last drop. I'm sitting on the bed and hear a knock and someone saying my name. 2 seconds later, before I get the chance to answer or even understand where the noise was coming from, I hear keys turning in the lock and the door opening. As you might have guessed, it's the connecting door next to the bedroom. The guy enters, says he can't find his phone and he might have left it downstairs. I'm a bit shocked, probably because if it had come 10 minutes later, I would have been naked, ready to take a shower, or maybe walking around in a towel, since I'm supposedly alone. I know it might sound like I'm a pussy, but keep in mind I'm a relatively young woman, alone in a house with a man in his 40s or 50s, who has control over when he can get into my place at any time. I stay polite and try and tell him that no, I haven't seen his phone. He still comes in, speaking a lot and very fast while I'm sitting there, not fully realising what's happening and not having a chance to tell him to leave. He looks around the flat and obviously doesn't find the phone. Then he says he's sorry and asks if everything is fine, if I had dinner or something like that, and then he leaves again. At this point, I'm wondering if I should just stay or not, since I know you get refunded only if you cancel 2 nights in advance. I just thought I would lose the money for the night that has started, and the following one maybe, knowing if I'd booked at least 4 nights. I really needed to take a shower, but questioning if I should. I tried to see if there are available hotel rooms, but it's already too late to book, or already fully booked. I decided to take my shower real quick, wondering if he could hear the water, and decide that he forgot something else as an excuse to get in again. Nothing bad happens. I then go back to the bedroom, get dressed as fast as I can, and just sit down and think. I decide that I'll stay for just one night, and probably be less paranoid in the morning if I'm still alive. That's when I notice the chairs in the bedroom. There are two, and one of them has ropes tied around the armrests. The chairs are in good shape, and the rope is definitely not there to keep the armrest fixed to the chair. To this day, I have no idea why they were there. I still think I should sleep there just for a night, and try to use the chair to block the door handle in the bedroom, like in the movies. But guys, this only works in the movies. I try with both chairs, trying to pile them up, even trying to use the ropes one way or another. The handle can still go down enough to open the door easily. I think that at least if I leave them in the front door, I'll hear if someone tries to open it. But the door opens the other way, and in any case, I don't know what I'll do even if the noise did wake me up. Again, I know I'm paranoid and anxious, but living alone, abroad, my motto is to never ever take risks for my own safety, as I'm usually the only one who can save myself. So it's better to avoid any tricky situation. However, this was definitely a tricky situation. I was seconds away from falling asleep. Maybe I'd already been asleep, I don't know. I was in that stage where you just sort of slip in and out. I looked over towards the door, just to check it for peace of mind, and I realised it was already open by a crack. My senses heightened. I tried to pick up any sort of signal that I was not alone in the bedroom. Then it became clear to me that wasn't my breathing that I could hear. This happened to me during my first year of university, in October. I was living in the dorms, and I need to give you a brief rundown of the rooms. You need a key card to gain access to your specific floor, so even though someone on the 3rd and 4th floor live in the same building, they can't access each other's floors. I had injured myself playing sports, so I was under orders to rest, which meant no Halloween parties for me. Pretty sad for a horror fiend like myself, but to try and make the time a happy one, I busied myself helping to make costumes for people and doing their makeup. Once I was finally finished, I packed up my makeup and decided to watch some movies in my room. A guy popped up and introduced himself. We chatted a bit and exchanged email addresses, and I walked back to my room and said goodnight. The first warning sign was that he walked into my room behind me. Despite me saying I was going to walk into my room, I felt really awkward and tried to say in a roundabout way that he needed to leave, but he wasn't getting the hint. I finally had to say, "You need to leave my room now." I chalked this up to him maybe being drunk or something, but I did wonder how he got onto my floor if he wasn't with anyone party. Before I went to bed that night, I checked my email, and there were 5 from that creep. The first being, "Hey, I'm so glad we're friends," and the rest asking why I wasn't online. A few days later, I got a knock on my door when I was studying, and it was him. I explained that I was studying and needed privacy. He tried to walk into my room again, but I braced my arm on the frame and said firmly that I need to study. The next day it was at my door again, and the next, and the next. I began pretending I wasn't home. Another day there was a knock at the door, and when I checked the peephole, there was no one there, and I assumed the postman had come. I opened the door and lo and behold, it was that creepy guy. He'd began hiding from the peephole, so I'd be more likely to answer the door to him. I told my roommate never to open the door if he was there, and I told people living on my floor that this guy was beginning to creep me out. So if he wanted to get on the floor, whatever sob story he gave them, don't let him on. A few days after that, I was on the bus coming home, and I got a text from someone who lived on my floor telling me not to come back because the creep was on the floor and sitting in front of my door, just waiting. I went to a friend's house and spent the night, and when I got home, I was told he waited for 4 fucking hours before leaving. At this point, I was getting freaked out. A few days after that, he began waiting outside the building, and if I left, he would follow me wherever I went. I was too spineless to tell him to go away, and I tried to be more passive about it. I never spoke, and never gave him any indication I was paying attention, but he followed me to class, the cafeteria, and everywhere else. I went to the resident advisor and told her what had happened. She spoke to the RA for his floor and was told that the creep had been telling his own RA that we were best friends and dating. My RA tried to explain that I was uncomfortable, but the other RA believed him, and that was that. Thankfully, one thing did deter him. He would never approach me if I was with a group of people. So my floor mates banded together. If I went to dinner, so did they. If I went for a drink, so did they. If I went to class, so did they. He got onto my floor once when someone else was coming home, and he forced his foot in the door to let himself in. I was hidden in another room, and when he left my door to go and sit in the television lounge to wait for me, I went downstairs and ran around the other side of the building and got into my room before he noticed. Then the phone calls began. I never gave him my number, but somehow he obtained my mobile and my room phone, and at first it would be 1 to 2 calls a day until I told him I wanted him to leave me alone. Then the calls began coming in every hour, with him begging and pleading for me to talk to him. He would call every day without caller ID, and that was the problem. I needed to use the phone. Like I said, I was suffering from an injury, and I needed to talk to the physicist to help me recover. I went back to the RA and begged her to help me. She went to the head of the dorms and explained everything that had happened. I explained how far this had gone, and my roommate told them that he had followed her for a few times, demanding that she tell him where I was. I felt awful. She never told me this because she was afraid of upsetting me further, and I felt like I was an arsehole for putting her through this garbage. I don't know what went on behind closed doors. From what I guess, he was told to leave me alone, and any further contact would result in him being kicked out of the dorms. There was one email that he went completely insane on me, telling me how awful I was. How could I do this to him? We were so happy together. Surely I was cheating on him with other men. After that, nothing. At first, I'd see him around campus. I'd run to the women's toilets to hide. I'd see him around town or around campus. He'd always just stare at me. Never tried to approach me. Never tried to get my attention. Just staring. I used to walk by and try and pretend that I didn't notice him. I'd try really hard, but I was sweating and my heart just wouldn't stop pounding. A little backstory. I'm a 20-year-old, short, petite female working at Subway, and I can't help be nice to anyone, even if they creep me out. I'm a people pleaser, what can I say? And it usually ends in me feeling like shit. About a year ago we had this guy, 35 to 40 years old. He'd come in every day for his lunch. He was fascinated about my stretched ears and a few piercings I had on my face, and always asked questions. He would sit down after I rang him out and would watch me from his table for 2 hours, non-stop, just staring at me while I helped other customers. This goes on for about 2 weeks. Every day he'd ask for my number, saying he has plugs and tunnels he wants to give me, and see me wearing them in my ears, and I always politely declined. One day, I'm alone in the store because my manager had to run to the bank. We were really slow that day, so I was just in the back room messing around on my phone. I heard the door chime, looked up, and yet no one was there. Then I saw the man walk past the front of the store really quickly, like he was in a hurry. The store phone rings. "Thanks for calling Subway. How can I help you?"
This is the girl with the nice ears, right?
Yeah? Who is this?
Are you alone in the back room right now? Are you working by yourself?
At this point I got really creeped out and I knew it was him. I hung up and texted my manager the situation so she'd hurry back. He called again, this time asking me very, very weird questions, like what I would do with him in a room that was locked, if I had a boyfriend, why I was playing hard to get, etc, etc. My manager gets back and I tell her everything. In the middle of lunch rush, he calls again. This time my manager answers the phone, and to this day she never told me what he said, but the look on her face made my spine shiver. She told him if he called again or showed up here again, she would call the police. I thought that was the end of it, but alas, I was wrong. 1 week later, I'm clocking out and getting ready to walk to my parked car in the front. When I look outside, I see him standing by my car, looking inside of it. I was an idiot and left the back door unlocked. I watched him crawl inside and shut the door. The creep was trying to hide in my fucking back seat, and God knows what he would do to me when I got in. My manager locked the door of the store and called the police. When they arrived, they had to pretty much drag him out of my car, and he was arrested. On him, he had a butcher's knife, rope, and a rag with chloroform on it. If I hadn't looked up when I did, let's just say I probably wouldn't be writing this story right now. When I first moved into a new place in a new town, I'd left home one evening and accidentally left my garage door open. I texted my husband to tell him to go home and close it. He gets there and tells me it's not open. That's strange, but okay. The next day I'm taking my trash out and my neighbours were outside. He introduced himself and told me that the night before he had noticed me leaving and I'd left my garage door open. So he went inside and closed it for me. And he let himself out through the front door, only locking the doorknob. Then he sent me a Facebook friend request. I'm assuming he looked at the mail on the counter to find out my full name. After this he wrote me poems and taped them to my door, left gifts on the front porch, made crazy Facebook posts about a woman he was in love with who was forbidden. I'm guessing because I'm married. One Saturday night I came home really late and I was finishing my cigarette outside of my garage before going in. He was sitting outside in a chair, blistering drunk. He approached me and started talking about someone named George. I had no idea what he was going on about, and confused, I asked him if he had company. He walked into the garage and came out of a box containing George. George was his stepdad, and he was dead. The ashes were in that box. He caught wind of a trip I was going on via Facebook and invited himself along. I politely explained that I'm married and all of this wacky behaviour was unacceptable. A few days later I'd gone on a walk with my husband and we left through the garage, leaving the door open. He messaged me on Facebook and told me he'd left a gift for me in my garage. When I got back, I found a bunch of camping gear inside of a giant Easter egg. After I got back from the trip, he showed up at the door at midnight, drunk and banging on the door. I wish I could say we moved before it got much, much worse. I've had a couple of stalkers. The one that freaked me out the most was in another country, and we never met. We first started talking on a website for pen pals. He lived in another country. He developed feelings really, really fast. I liked him very much in the beginning. Our relationship became sexual in nature. We made plans to meet. I was concerned with some things I considered red flags, confirmed by my friends and family. I decided to back off a bit. He didn't like that at all. I was super passive, trying to keep the peace without hurting or losing my friend. I started lying to him, out of fear. He'd interrogate me for hours about where I was going and who I was with. If I went to a party, he'd ask if I had slept with anyone, and then say he kind of hoped I had, so I could tell him how the sex was. It was getting to be too much. I was no longer interested in him romantically or sexually, but I would still engage with him sexually, just because I was afraid of him. In the meantime, I'd met and fell in love with my current soulmate, who was absolutely wonderful. Stalker was obsessed with everything about my budding relationship and wouldn't leave me be. I finally realised that my stalker made me feel disgusting and I should not be involved with someone who made me feel afraid and disgusted. I told him that I didn't want to hear from him ever again. He ignored me. My soulmate contacted him and told him to leave me alone. He tried to interrogate him about the nature of our relationship, but my soulmate shut him down. I blocked him on everything. I realised that he was still reading my blog, so I deleted the whole thing. He made new email accounts and Facebook accounts constantly. He relentlessly Googled me and my partner, to the point that our names were amongst the top searches on multiple search engines. When he elicited no response, he started sending my partner screenshots of times we'd been sexual. I was mortified, but since I'd been 100% honest with him, it didn't break us up. My soulmate was obviously disturbed. We never responded to anything he sent. To my knowledge, he still creeps on us, but after that everything mostly stopped. I know he's probably thousands of miles away, and I've had stalkers who are in my immediate area, but he still scares me the most, especially because he types and even sometimes sounds like the way my now husband sounds. When I was in my final 2 years of high school, I'd get tutored for maths by a guy we called Brian. Brian was at least 65 years old and worked for the tutoring centre. I'd see him 2 afternoons a week for 45 minutes each. He seemed like a very lonely guy, never married, no kids, and from what I could tell, he had very little friends. I felt quite sorry for him. I was always really nice to Brian, and to avoid having to do maths homework, I would just ask him questions and try to start a conversation. All was well when I finished high school, and that was that. About 1 year later, my best friend's younger brother got tutored by Brian as well, and one day when dropping my friend's brother off, I said, "Say hi to Brian for me," as we got out of the car. About a week later, I received a letter in the mail. It was from Brian. He was saying how he'd really like me, and now that he was tutoring Ben, Friend's younger brother, he was excited that I mentioned to say hi. He took this the wrong way, and in the letter basically confessed the feelings he had had for me, and was so glad I felt the same way. He said some very creepy things in the letter about how I looked good in my school uniform, and always wanted to tell me that, but didn't want to get in trouble. I told my parents about this letter, and they approached the tutoring centre and told the owners. He ended up getting fired for this letter, and also for accessing personal information of clients for him to send the letter. About a week later I started receiving flowers at my doorstep, and then that would be followed up with text messages to my mobile number, saying,
Hope you like the flowers, and give me a call if you want to get a coffee.
My parents took this to the police, who then got in contact with Brian, and he was cautioned, and I never heard from him again after that. Although, according to Ben, Brian might have met a quite terrible fate in the end. I was 18 at the time, although commonly mistaken for being in my early teens, and had just finished some errands in town and decided to take a shortcut to catch the bus home. Said shortcut being a narrow street one of the shopping centre's entrances opened onto. It was honestly more of a glorified alleyway, but since the street connected onto the high street and it was the quickest way into the shopping centre, it usually got a decent amount of foot traffic and was extremely safe to use. However, depending on the time of day, there may only be very few, if any, people there, and that was just the case on this day. Just as I was walking out of the entrance and celebrating the fact I wasn't blocked by people standing around talking, a young man around my age startled me by stepping out of a small alcove beside the door and blocking my path.
Oh, hi there. How are you? Have you been shopping?
The way he'd approached me immediately put me off, but the overly familiar, fancy seeing you here sort of tone he was using made me hesitant for a moment, wondering if it was just someone from high school who recognised me and wanted to say hello. So I muttered,
Yeah, hi.
to stall for a moment while I racked my brain for who it could be. It didn't take me long to confirm I didn't know a good-looking, fit, blonde 20-something-year-old with bright blue eyes and a heavy accent, and since I couldn't think of a good reason someone like that would approach me, my socially awkward, non-confrontational past self decided the best way to deal with the situation was just to dodge around him and leave. But he didn't let me though. Instead of taking the hint, he immediately started walking in stride with me, on the side of the street closest to the road, so that I was between him and the side of a building. When I tried to speed up because I didn't like the feeling of being penned in, he sped up alongside me, keeping me between him and the wall. As off-putting as this already was, he began asking me questions that seemed innocent enough, but all centred around where I was headed, and if anyone was going to be there for me.
Where are you going now? Have you not finished your shopping? Are you meeting your friends? Maybe I could come with you. Or are you meeting your family instead? Do you have a boyfriend? Is he who you're meeting? Or are you going home? Do you live near here, or are you just getting the bus?
I'd already asked him to leave me alone once, and he acted like I hadn't even said anything, so I was just ignoring his questions and glancing around desperately hoping someone else would enter the street with us, in case he didn't react well to being asked a second time. And that is why I noticed the second man. He was older, in his late 30s or early 40s, with dark hair, a short but scruffy beard, and had the kind of face and expression that tells you that you might need to be cautious when dealing with this person. I have no idea where he came from. My guess is that he was hiding in the alcove on the other side of the door, but he was now walking in line with us on the opposite side of the road, staring the entire time. I tried not to let either of the men realise I had seen him, while my brain went into overdrive trying to figure out what their end game was. Were they going to assault me? Surely they wouldn't risk being caught doing that in broad daylight right outside of a shopping centre. Maybe they were just going to rob me. But if they wanted to do that, the blonde could have just grabbed my bag and ran when he had the element of surprise, back when he was hiding behind the door. Then I remembered something that made my blood run cold. At the end of the street was an underground parking garage, the entrance of which opened up onto the pavement me and the blonde were walking on, and I'd have to walk right past it because of the way he was penning me in towards the wall. It would take him barely any effort to shove me through it, and the dark-haired man across the street had been toying with something in his pocket that I was worried at first was a weapon. But what if it was car keys? What if they were planning to drag me in there
and into a car, take me to who knows where, and do who knows what to me. We were very close to the end of the street now, so I abruptly dropped back behind the blonde and darted towards the road, wanting to get away from the garage and making a beeline for the end of the street without getting within arm's reach of the dark-haired man. The blonde immediately darted after me and blocked my path, herding me back towards the pavement and penning me in so close to the wall this time that my arm was almost scraping across it as I walked. All while still talking to me casually, as if he wasn't doing anything wrong. They obviously knew the game was up at this point though, and when I glanced over to the dark-haired man to check where he was, he locked eyes with me, laughed, and called out to the blonde in a different language. The best I was able to determine later was that it was Eastern European, but not Lithuanian, Polish, Romanian or Russian, saying something that made him laugh too, and doubled down on his "is anyone gonna miss you" questions, while also asking me if I ever had a boyfriend, if I'd ever kissed a boy, would I like him to be my boyfriend, etc, etc. Obviously, I continued to ignore them and was panicking more and more as we approached the garage, but, fortunately for me, the dark-haired man started to lose his patience with the blonde's lack of progress with me and began snapping at him, presumably demanding he get me to answer because the blonde looked worried and his tone was getting more urgent every time he spoke to him. Only a few feet from the garage, the dark-haired man apparently crossed the line because the blonde suddenly looked furious, stopped walking, spun around and started shouting at him. I immediately took the opportunity to bolt for the end of the street, and although I heard the blonde shout at me, and what I assumed was them both running behind me, I managed to get round the corner and lose them by ducking down the next street, and then several more just to be safe. I didn't feel safe enough to go to my original bus stop, just in case they stayed in the area and saw me, so I headed for one several blocks away, on edge and jumping at the slightest thing until I was on the bus and headed home. Although I tried to report the incident to the police, they weren't particularly interested since neither of the men had actually put their hands on me, and I had no proof of what I assumed they were planning to do to me. I never heard about any abductions, assaults or robberies in that area, so I'm hoping they simply gave up after the plan didn't work with me. I'm glad I was paranoid enough to save myself from that situation, but do worry sometimes that another girl wasn't as lucky. This entire scenario happened a few years ago when I used to take walks alone, occasionally at night, which is something I thought very little of, since I lived in a heavily residential, wealthy area. In other words, on the trail I'd frequent, houses were usually within sight. On one such night, shortly into my walk, I see a figure walking a few hundred feet behind me, something I knew immediately was odd, considering it was around 10 at night. At first I discounted this though, since it was a public trail, and they could have very well been doing the exact same thing as me, just going for a walk. I continued on for roughly 5 to 10 minutes or so, before looking behind me once again, only to find the same person was still trailing me. Keep in mind, at this point, I'd gone through a few turns by now on the trail, meaning it was becoming more and more unlikely that this person just so happened to be going to the same location. I decided to take odd paths and directions, turning off into gravel and weird or more roundabout side areas, and they still followed me. By the time I was reaching the apex of my journey, passing by the local park, they were maybe less than 60 feet behind me, a distance they could easily have covered in seconds. It's then that I decided to call my family. I had researched for this, I knew what to do, and believe it or not, the call didn't go through. As it turns out, my phone was a recent gift and its service had been set up improperly, meaning that no matter how many times I frantically called in at that moment, nothing would happen. In the decision I call back to as one of my best to this day, I acted as if the call had gone through and was on the phone with my mum, miming out and talking audibly about my location and the person behind me, beginning to briefly describe them. Even in the act, I wasn't able to really do so, as I could never get a proper view of their face, as if it was somehow shrouded in something, but I did my best with what I had. Sure enough, when I turned around again, they were nowhere to be seen. Not that they had turned off and walked to another direction, but they just weren't there to begin with. Weeks later, my mum told me that a police officer had come into her work and warned about abductions that had been happening in our area, specifically for child trafficking and organ trade. I count myself as very lucky, and whenever I leave the house now, I'm very aware only doing so during the day, while taking a large knife with me. When I was around 13-14, I went to Appleby Festival in England with my family. My family comes from the Gypsies, but we all now live in houses. They no longer participate in gypsy culture, and I was not brought up as a gypsy, but they decided that we should all go to the festival. As young teens, me and my cousin, who was around the same age, decided to wander off and do our own thing. We met a group of guys the same age as us and decided to hang around with them. We reached the outskirts of the festival when suddenly one of the boys picks me up and tries to drag me into the bushes. I've always been pretty strong for a petite female who's only 5 foot, and fought for my life. I elbowed him in the face and kicked him multiple times as hard as I could. Everyone, including my cousin who was in shock, was just staring at this going on and didn't do anything. I finally managed to get away and ran as fast as I could. I have no idea what would have happened if I couldn't fight the way I did. 10 years later, this still scares me, and I haven't been to a gypsy festival since.